The morning Harlan Briggs decided to make an example of a child, he did it in front of everyone. He rode straight into the Blackstone yard at 7:30, his horse scattering gravel, and he didn't slow down until he was close enough to make the boy flinch. The child, couldn't have been more than 6 years old, had been carrying a bucket of water toward the horse trough. Harlan leaned down from the saddle and knocked it clean out of his hands. Water soaked the dirt. The bucket rolled. "Pick that up," Harlan said, not to be helpful, to watch it happen. The boy looked up at him, didn't cry. That seemed to make Harlan angrier. "You don't belong here," Harlan said, loud enough for the hands nearby to hear. "None of you do. Your daddy's a charity case, and everybody on this ranch knows it." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. That silence, that particular ugly silence, was the moment Silas Bennett realized that surviving wasn't going to be enough. He was going to have to fight for something harder than survival. He was going to have to fight for his children's dignity, and he wasn't sure yet if he had enough left in him to do it. If this is your first time here, we'd love for you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single chapter of this story, or any of the powerful stories we share every week. Hit the like button if you believe every family deserves a fighting chance, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We truly want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The wagon had been making a sound for the last 40 miles that Silas couldn't quite name. Not a squeak, not a groan. Something in between, the sound of something that had been holding on too long and was finally starting to think about letting go. He understood that sound completely. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins and didn't say anything about it because the children were already tired of hearing bad news. Eli, his oldest at 14, sat up front beside him with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the flat Wyoming land roll past like he was trying to decide whether to trust it. Thomas, 12, was in the back with the twins, Cora and Owen, both 6, keeping them entertained with a story he'd half invented, half remembered from their mother. Silas could hear Thomas's voice rising and falling, doing different voices for each character, and he held on to that sound the way a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. He didn't let himself think about Clara, not on travel days. Travel days required all of him. The Blackstone Ranch spread out across the northern slope of the valley like something that had always been there and always would be. That was the first thing Silas noticed about it. Not the size, not the fences, not the distant figures of men moving cattle across the far pasture. It was the permanence of it. The way it sat in the land as if the land had been shaped around it rather than the other way around. It made his chest tight in a way he didn't fully understand. He'd gotten the job through a hiring agent named Caldwell, who passed through Rollins 3 weeks back, looking for experienced hands for the spring drive and beyond. Silas had approached him at the general store, hat in hand, and given him the honest version of himself. 39 years old, worked cattle since he was 11, knew horses, fences, weather patterns, and hard seasons. Caldwell had looked him over with the practiced indifference of a man who evaluated livestock for a living. "Blackstone pays fair," Caldwell had said. "Expects more than fair in return." "That's fine," Silas said. "But you should know before you write anything down. I'm not coming alone." Caldwell had looked up from his ledger. "I've got 4 children. I go, they go. That's not negotiable." The pause that followed was long enough that Silas had started preparing himself to walk away. Then Caldwell wrote something in the ledger and said, without looking up, "The owner makes the final call on accommodations. I'll note it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And Silas had learned, in the 2 years since Clara died, that the space between yes and no was where most of his life happened. He told the children that night at their campfire, keeping his voice steady and his face neutral the way he'd practiced. Eli hadn't said anything for a long time. Thomas had asked 3 practical questions about distance and timing. Cora had wanted to know if there would be other girls her age. Owen had fallen asleep in Silas's lap before the conversation was finished, his small weight against Silas's ribs like something sacred and impossible. Now they were here. And as Silas guided the wagon through the main gate of Blackstone Ranch, he could already feel eyes on them, not welcoming eyes, measuring ones. The yard was busy. Mid-morning, hands moving in every direction with the particular purposeful energy of a working operation. A group of 4 men near the fence stopped what they were doing as the wagon rolled past. Silas heard one of them say something low, and 2 others laughed. Eli heard it too. Silas watched his son's jaw tighten and felt his own do the same. He pulled the wagon up near what appeared to be the main barn and set the brake. For a moment he just sat there, taking the ranch in. The buildings were solid, well maintained. The horses in the nearest corral looked healthy and well fed. Whatever else Blackstone Ranch was, it wasn't a failing operation. "Papa," Owen said from behind him. "Are we there?" "We're there," Silas said. He climbed down and helped Cora down after him, and then Owen, who immediately grabbed his hand and pressed close against his leg. Thomas and Eli jumped down on their own. They stood there beside the wagon, 5 people with everything they owned packed into a space smaller than most men's bunk rooms, and Silas put his shoulders back and waited. A man he didn't recognize came striding across the yard, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors and very little of it smiling. "You Bennett?" the man said. "I am." The man looked at the children. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted, a slight tightening around the eyes that Silas had seen before and knew how to read. "I'm Holt, foreman. Caldwell told us you were coming." He paused. "Didn't mention 4 of them." "He knew," Silas said. "I was clear about it." Holt looked at the children again, then back at Silas. "Uh-huh." He turned and pointed toward a low building at the edge of the yard. "There's a room at the end of the bunkhouse. It's not large. Was used for storage. We'll make it work," Silas said. "You'll have to." Holt turned and walked away, already calling out to someone across the yard. Silas looked down at Owen, who was watching Holt go with very serious eyes. "He seems grumpy," Owen said. "He might just be busy," Silas said. Owen thought about this. "Or grumpy," he said. It was the first thing that made Silas almost smile all day. They moved their things into the room at the end of the bunkhouse. It was, as Holt had said, not large. It was also dusty, damp in one corner, and smelled like old grain and something Silas preferred not to identify. 2 small windows, neither of which opened easily. A single iron stove. No furniture beyond what they'd brought. Eli stood in the middle of the room and looked around with an expression that Silas knew meant he was thinking something he wasn't going to say. Thomas measured the space with his arms spread wide, calculating. Cora found a crack in the wall near the floor and immediately decided it was interesting. Owen looked at his father. "It's small," Owen said. "It is," Silas said. "But it's ours." "For now," Silas said. "For as long as we earn it." Owen seemed to accept this. He went to one of the windows and tried to look out. He couldn't quite reach. "I want to see the horses," he said. "Tomorrow," Silas said. "Tonight we get sorted." While the children unpacked what little they had, Silas stepped outside and leaned against the building and let himself have 2 minutes of feeling the full weight of it. The distance they'd traveled. The uncertainty ahead. The faces of his children, which he monitored constantly for cracks in their composure. The way a man monitors a dam during spring flood. He thought about Clara, just briefly, just enough to remind himself why he was here. Because she would have done the same for them. She would have done more. He straightened up, went back inside, and started building a fire in the iron stove. He reported to Holt the following morning before sunrise. The foreman put him on fence line work for the first week. A test, Silas understood, of whether he could follow instructions and stay out of trouble. He didn't mind. The work was straightforward and gave him time to learn the layout of the ranch, the rhythms of its operation, the names and temperaments of the people around him. Some of the hands were decent enough in a guarded sort of way, cautious, waiting to see who he was before committing to an opinion. Others had already formed their opinion and wore it plainly. A wiry, sharp-faced man named Harlan Briggs appeared to be the informal ringleader of the second group. On Silas's 3rd morning on the ranch, Harlan had stood at the fence with 2 other men and watched Silas work with his arms crossed. "Heard you got 4 kids," Harlan said. Silas kept working. "That's right. How's a man end up on a cattle ranch with 4 kids and nothing else?" "Same as anyone ends up anywhere," Silas said. "Things happen." "What kind of things?" Silas straightened and looked at Harlan directly. "The kind that aren't your business." Harlan held his gaze for a moment, then smiled in the way people smile when they're filing information away for later use. It was 3 days after that, the morning with the water bucket, that Silas understood the specific shape of the problem he was dealing with. He'd been on the far side of the yard when he saw it happen. Owen, walking carefully with the bucket, Harlan's horse appearing out of nowhere at a speed that was entirely deliberate, and then the impact, and the water soaking the dirt, and the bucket rolling, and Owen standing there very still while Harlan said what he said. Silas crossed the yard at a controlled pace because running would have meant arriving hot, and arriving hot in front of an audience was exactly what Harlan would want. He reached his son and crouched down and said quietly, "You okay?" Owen nodded. His lower lip was doing something complicated. "Good," Silas said. He picked up the bucket and handed it to one of the younger hands nearby. "Refill this for him, would you?" Then he stood and looked at Harlan, who was still in the saddle, watching with that same smile. "That was an accident," Harlan said, in the tone of someone who wants to be challenged. "I'm sure it was," Silas said. His voice was flat and completely level. "Boys shouldn't be carrying things in the middle of the yard." "He was doing what I asked him to do," Silas said. "He'll keep doing it." The smile on Harlan's face sharpened into something less friendly. "You letting your children do ranch work? That what you brought them here for?" "I brought them here because they go where I go," Silas said. "And they pull their weight because that's what we do." "Pull their weight," Harlan repeated. He glanced at the men watching. "A 6-year-old pulling his weight. That's something you're proud of, Bennett?" Silas didn't answer. He looked at Owen, put a hand briefly on the top of his head and said, "Go help Cora with breakfast," and watched his son walk away with his back straight and his chin up, and felt something in his chest that was half grief and half fierce, burning pride. He turned back to the yard and picked up where he'd left off, and he didn't look at Harlan again, and after a while Harlan rode away. But the problem was still there. It had just been given a name. By the end of the first week, Silas had a rough map of the ranch's social terrain. Holt was fair but detached, not hostile but not interested in getting involved in anything that wasn't directly his concern. There were perhaps a dozen hands who would eventually make up their own minds about the Bennetts. There were 4 or 5 who had already signed on with Harlan's version of events, and those were the ones to watch. And then there was Vivienne Blackstone herself, who Silas had not yet spoken to directly. He'd seen her twice at a distance. She was younger than he'd expected, 30, maybe 32, and moved through the ranch with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly what everything on the property was worth. She didn't look like someone who made charitable decisions. She looked like someone who made calculated ones, which made it harder, not easier, to understand why she'd agreed to hire him. That question was answered on the 8th day. He was finishing work on a section of fence near the north pasture when he heard a horse coming up behind him. He turned and she was there. Vivienne Blackstone, sitting a dark bay horse with the easy posture of someone who'd grown up in the saddle, watching him. "Bennett," she said. "Ma'am," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "How's the room working out?" "Fine," he said. "We've made it comfortable enough." "Children settling in?" He hesitated. "Settling," he said, which was the honest answer. She seemed to hear the gap in it. "I've heard there's been some friction." He looked at her directly. She had steady, dark eyes that weren't giving anything away. "Nothing we can't manage," he said. "That's not what I asked." He set down his fence tool and straightened. "Your foreman and your hands aren't sure why I'm here," he said. "Some of them think you made a mistake. The kind of men who think that tend to let you know about it." "And you think I made a mistake?" "No," he said, without hesitating. She studied him for a moment. "Caldwell said you were the best cattleman he'd seen come through Rawlins in 3 years, said you turned down 2 other positions that paid more." "I needed a place my children could be," he said, "not just work." "And now they're here," she said. "Are you going to be able to do the job?" "Yes." "Are they going to cost me problems I don't need?" He thought of Owen standing with the empty bucket, chin up, back straight. "They're going to earn their keep," Silas said. "Same as me. I'll vouch for all 4 of them." She looked at him a moment longer, then something in her expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but settled, as if a decision she'd already made privately had just been confirmed out loud. "Carry on then, Bennett," she said, and turned her horse and rode back toward the ranch house. He stood there for a moment and watched her go, and then he picked up his fence tool and went back to work. That night at supper in their cramped room, beans, salt pork, cornbread that Cora had made herself with only minor assistance. Silas sat at the small table with his 4 children and ate and listened to them talk. Thomas described in accurate detail the specific knot pattern he'd seen one of the experienced hands use on a gate latch, and the way he talked about it made Silas realize his son had already been watching the operations closely, learning the ranch the way he learned everything, quietly, systematically. Eli had fixed a broken hinge on the bunkhouse door, and nobody had asked him to. Cora had somehow already made friends with the cook's helper, a shy girl named Ada who'd given her half a jar of blackberry preserves. Owen said, "A man called me a charity case today." Everyone went quiet. Silas looked at his youngest son. "Who?" "One of the fencemen. He said we're here because the owner feels sorry for us." Owen looked at his plate, then back up. "Is that true?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "We're here because I work hard enough that someone needed me," he said, "and I made it clear that my children come with me, and that condition was accepted. That's not charity. That's a contract." "But why would she agree to it?" Eli said. He hadn't meant it to sound like an accusation, but it was close enough to one. "I don't know yet," Silas said, because the truth was the only thing he had left to give them. "But I intend to make sure she never regrets it." Eli looked at his plate. "We're going to have to prove everything," he said quietly, "every single day." "Yes," Silas said, "we are." "I don't think that's fair," Cora said, with the directness of a 10-year-old who had not yet learned to filter her outrage. "It might not be," Silas said, "but it's what's in front of us." Owen ate a bite of cornbread and chewed it thoughtfully. Then, "The cook's name is Randall, and he gives extra biscuits to people who say good morning to him first." Thomas looked up. "Is that a strategy you're already using?" "Since day 2, Owen said, and Silas laughed. A real laugh, short and unexpected, the first one in weeks. And it moved through the room like something warm coming back into circulation. The next morning, Harlan Briggs was waiting at the gate when Silas came out for work before sunrise, not blocking the way. Just standing there, the way a man stands when he wants you to know he's been thinking. "You know what she paid for this ranch?" Harlan said. 6 years ago, before she turned it into what it is." Silas said nothing. "More than your grandfather's grandfather ever saw in his life," Harlan said. "She built this place by being smart, by not carrying dead weight." He paused. "No offense." "Some taken," Silas said. Harlan looked at him steadily. "You seem like a man who knows how the world works, Bennett. I'm just asking you to think about what happens when she realizes you're more trouble than you're worth. Because that day's coming. I've seen it before." "You've seen a lot of things," Silas said. "I have." "Then you've seen men who knew their own worth," Silas said. "And you've seen what happens when you try to talk them out of it." He walked past Harlan and went to work. He worked that day harder than he'd worked in months. Not to prove anything to Harlan. He'd decided the night before that proving things to Harlan was a losing proposition, and he wanted no part of it. He worked that hard because the ranch was watching him, whether it knew it was or not, and because his children would feel the consequence of every impression he made, and because the only thing he'd ever known how to do in the face of people trying to diminish him was to do his work so well that it became the only language in the room. By midday, he'd completed the fencing assignment, found and fixed a section of collapsed irrigation channel that hadn't been on anyone's task list, and helped 2 of the younger hands restrain a horse that had gotten spooked and was threatening to injure itself against a corner post. That afternoon, Holt walked up beside him without preamble. "Irrigation channel in the east field was blocking the water flow," Holt said. "Maintenance team had it scheduled for 2 weeks from now." "It needed doing," Silas said. "You weren't assigned to it." "No." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, "The horse this morning, Pinto. She gets spooked by shadow movement. You figured that out?" "Took a while," Silas said. "Kept her head turned so the shadow was behind her." Another silence. "You know horses," Holt said. "I've known a few," Silas said. Holt nodded once, slowly, and walked away. It was not praise. It was barely acknowledgement. But it was different from what had come before, and Silas filed it away carefully. That evening he found Eli in the corral, sitting on the top rail, watching the horses settle for the night with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "What happened?" Silas said. "Nothing." "Eli." His son was quiet for a moment. Two of the men were talking at lunch. Didn't know I was near enough to hear. He picked at the fence rail with one thumb. Said you're wasting your time here. Said Vivienne Blackstone doesn't keep charity projects once the novelty wears off. Said you'll be gone by winter. Silas climbed up on the rail and sat beside him. You believe that? He said. Eli was a long time answering. I believe we've been gone by winter before, he said. Silas let that sit between them for a moment. Your mother used to say there's a difference between leaving and being run off, he said. Eli looked at him. We've left places, Silas said, when there was nothing left to stay for. But I've never been run off anywhere, and I don't intend to start here. What if she decides they're right, Eli said. What if she looks at us and decides the trouble isn't worth it? Then we'll have worked hard and learned a new ranch and moved on, Silas said, and we'll find the next place, same as we always have. I'm tired of the next place, Eli said quietly. The honesty of it landed like a stone in still water. I know, Silas said. Me too. They sat there on the fence rail in this cooling evening air, watching the horses, not talking for a while, and it was the quietest, honest conversation Silas had had with his oldest son in longer than he could remember. The next morning, it was Owen who caused the first shift in the ranch's opinion, entirely by accident. He had decided, on his own, without telling anyone, that the big bay horse in the second corral, the one the hands called Red and gave a wide berth because she'd bitten two of them in the past month, deserved a friend. Owen had watched the horse for 3 days from the fence and concluded that she wasn't mean, she was lonely, and that the solution was obvious. Silas found out about this when Holt came looking for him with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and something else entirely. Your youngest is in the corral with Red, Holt said. Silas's stomach dropped. He followed Holt at a run and stopped short at the fence. Owen was standing in the middle of the corral, about 3 feet from the mare, talking to her in a low, continuous murmur. Not reaching for her, not moving toward her, just talking. And Red, who had bitten 2 experienced hands and sent one of them to the bunkhouse with a wrapped wrist, was standing with her ears forward, her head tilted slightly, listening. He's been in there 20 minutes, one of the hands said quietly. Silas gripped the fence rail and said nothing. As they watched, Owen slowly extended one hand, palm up, with a small piece of carrot on it that he'd clearly been planning this visit with. Red stretched her neck forward, sniffed, took the carrot. Owen said something that no one outside the corral could hear. Red lowered her head and let the boy put one small hand on her nose. The group at the fence was absolutely silent. Well, Holt said after a moment, very quietly, I'll be damned. Silas climbed the fence and went in and stood beside his son. Owen, he said, keeping his voice low and even. She wasn't mean, Owen said, without looking away from the horse. She was just waiting for someone to figure that out. Silas stood there and looked at his 6-year-old son standing calm and steady with his hand on the nose of a horse that had injured 2 grown men, and he didn't trust himself to say anything for a moment. Come on out now, he said finally. Let her rest. Owen gave the horse one last pat, stepped back slowly and carefully, and climbed the fence with his father beside him. On the other side, the hands were quiet in a different way than they'd been before. Harlan Briggs was at the edge of the group. His expression was harder to read than usual. That was the first crack in the wall. It wasn't the last. Thomas, over the following week, had quietly become indispensable to the maintenance crew, not by ingratiating himself, but by having an eye for broken things and a patience for fixing them that bordered on obsessive. He found a windmill on the northern section that had been wobbling for weeks on a stripped bolt, diagnosed it in 10 minutes, fixed it in 30, and said nothing to anyone about it until Holt noticed it was running smoother. Cora had, through a combination of charm and sheer force of personality, worked her way into the kitchen on the grounds that Ada needed help, and she had nothing better to do in the evenings, and within 4 days had reorganized the dry storage in a way that the cook admitted made considerably more sense than what had been there before, while also managing to charm even the gruffest of the hands who came through for their meals. And Eli had done what Eli always did, watched, waited, assessed, and then acted with a precision that caught people off guard. The broken windmill Thomas had identified had a second issue, a mounting plate cracked nearly through, and it was Eli who'd seen it, gone to Holt directly, and explained what would happen to the windmill in a high wind if the plate wasn't replaced. Holt had looked at the plate, looked at Eli, and sent for the replacement part without a word. By the end of the second week, the whispers were different. Not uniformly positive, Harlan made sure of that, but different. The absolute certainty that the Bennetts were a liability had developed some hairline fractures. People were watching the children with a different quality of attention. Less contempt, more wariness. Which wasn't warmth, but it was a form of respect, and Silas would take it. What he was not prepared for was the evening Vivienne Blackstone walked into the cramped room at the end of the bunkhouse. She knocked first. He gave her that. He opened the door, and she was standing there in a plain work coat, looking not like the owner of the largest ranch in the county, but like someone who'd come to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "May I come in?" she said. He stepped back. The children were at the table, Thomas reading, Cora braiding Cora's own hair with her fingers, Eli sharpening a knife, Owen drawing something on a piece of paper with a stub of pencil. All four of them looked up at once. Vivienne took in the room, the neatness of it, everything in its place, nothing wasted, order built out of almost nothing. She looked at the children's faces. "I heard about what happened with Red," she said to Owen. Owen looked at her seriously. "She had a stone bruise on her front left," he said. "She was hurting and nobody noticed. That's why she was angry." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "How did you know that?" she asked. "I watched how she stood," Owen said. "She didn't put weight on it the same way." Another pause. "You're observant," Vivienne said. "My papa says that's the most useful thing a person can be," Owen said. Vivienne looked at Silas then. Silas met her eyes and said nothing. She looked around the room once more, at Thomas's book, at Cora's methodical work with her own hair, at Eli's careful, focused attention to the knife. Then she said, mostly to herself but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Caldwell was right." Then she said to Silas, "There's a larger room in the main house that's used for nothing. I'll have it open tomorrow." Silas started to say something about not wanting charity, about earning what they had, and she cut him off before he'd gotten 3 words out. "It's not charity," she said. "Charity is giving something for nothing. I'm giving it because I need this family functional and rested, not crammed into a space that was barely adequate for tool storage." She paused. "Besides," she said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, "this ranch has been running like a machine for years. Machines are efficient. They don't—" She stopped herself, started again. "You can turn it down if you want," she said, "but you'd be turning it down for pride, not practicality." Silas looked at his children. Owen was watching him with his head tilted. Cora had stopped braiding. Thomas had set down his book. "We'll take it," Eli said from the corner, without looking up from his knife. Silas looked at his oldest son. Eli was watching the knife, but the set of his jaw said everything. "We'll take it," Silas said. Vivienne nodded once. "Good night, then," she said, and left. In the silence that followed, Owen picked up his pencil and went back to drawing. "She smells like horses and pine soap," he said conversationally. "Owen," Cora said. "I'm just saying," Owen said. Silas sat down at the table and put his face in his hands for exactly 3 seconds. Then he straightened up and looked at his 4 children, their impossible, exhausting, irreplaceable faces, and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I will not let this be taken from them." The room in the main house was bigger than the one in the bunkhouse, and quieter, and smelled like cedar wood and old curtains. Owen declared it the best room he'd ever been in, which Silas knew wasn't entirely true, but accepted as the generous thing it was. Cora immediately identified which corner got the most morning light and claimed it for herself with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Thomas paced the perimeter, measuring it with his feet, and announced that they could fit everything they had and still have room to walk around, which was a standard of living they hadn't met in nearly 2 years. Eli said nothing. He set his pack down near the door, which was where he always put it, and looked out the window at the ranch yard below with his arms crossed. That was 3 days after Vivienne's visit to the bunkhouse. Those 3 days had not been simple. Moving into the main house, even into a back room that had been empty for months, was exactly the kind of thing that gave Harlan Briggs new material to work with, and he used it without hesitation. The morning after the move, Silas came out to find 3 of the hands standing near the water pump with their coffee, talking in voices just loud enough to carry. "Heard they're in the house now," one of them said. "Course they are," another said. "Charity case gets upgraded, always the way." What's next? She adopts them? Harlan was there too, leaning against the post, not saying anything for once, just listening and letting the others build the narrative he'd been constructing since the first week. He caught Silas's eye when Silas walked past and gave him a pleasant nod, and Silas nodded back and kept walking. He'd been thinking about Harlan Briggs a great deal in the past week, turning the problem over in his head the way you turn a stone over looking for what's underneath. The man wasn't simply cruel. Silas had known cruel men, and this wasn't quite that. Harlan was territorial. He'd been at Blackstone Ranch for 7 years, long enough that he'd come to think of his place in the operation as permanent and definitive, and the arrival of Silas Bennett with his 4 children had introduced a variable that Harlan hadn't calculated for and couldn't control. The hostility wasn't personal in the way Silas had first read it. It was the hostility of a man who felt the ground shifting under his feet and was looking for something solid to push against. That didn't make it easier to deal with. It just made it more predictable. The work continued. Silas was moved off fence line duty in his 3rd week and assigned to the cattle management rotation, which was what he'd been hired for, and which he understood the way most people understand their own names. Not by thinking about it, but by having lived with it so long it had become instinctive. Holt watched him work for 2 days and said nothing, and on the 3rd day gave him the eastern sector without explanation, which was about as loud a compliment as Holt appeared capable of making. The eastern sector was a particular challenge that spring. The grass in the lower pastures was coming in thin after the dry winter, and the cattle in that section were restless and prone to pressing the fence lines looking for better grazing. Silas spent his days on horseback, learning those cattle the way he'd learned every herd he'd ever worked, one animal at a time, reading their movements and their moods, tracking which ones were natural leaders and which were followers and which were the chronic fence testers who would pull the whole group into trouble if you didn't catch them early. He brought Eli with him on the 3rd day, not as a favor. As a matter of practicality, the sector was large enough that 2 sets of eyes were better than one, and Eli had been on a horse since he was 4 years old. But there was something else in the decision too, something Silas didn't articulate even to himself. He needed his son to see him doing the work he was built to do. Not struggling, not apologizing for their circumstances, not managing the opinions of people who didn't matter, just working, clean and sure and competent, in a way that needed no explanation. Eli rode beside him in the early morning cold without talking for a long time, which was fine. They'd always communicated best in motion. That one, Silas said eventually, nodding toward a rangy red steer on the far edge of the group. Eli looked. He's walking the fence line. Has been since I started out here. 1 more day and he'll push through. You want me to turn him? See if you can do it without spooking the 3 behind him. Eli read the angles for a moment, then moved his horse in a wide arc that took him around the back of the group in a way that was unhurried and almost invisible in its intention. The red steer lifted his head, assessed the new presence, and started drifting inward. The 3 behind him followed. Nobody spooked. Silas watched his son work and didn't say anything. After a while, Eli came back alongside him, and they rode in silence for a few minutes. Holt doesn't think we're leaving, Eli said. No, Silas said. The way he talks to you changed, I noticed. Holt's a practical man, Silas said. Practical men adjust. Harlan isn't going to adjust, Eli said. No, Silas agreed. So what do we do about Harlan? Silas considered this for a moment. We do what we're doing, he said. We work. We keep our heads. We don't give him anything to use. He doesn't need anything real, Eli said. He's been making things up fine on his own. That was accurate, and Silas didn't pretend otherwise. Then we wait, he said. Men like Harlan run on the energy other people give them. When nobody's responding the way he wants, he either escalates or he moves on. He paused. Either way, we'll be ready. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, what if he escalates toward the kids? That's the line, Silas said simply. He crosses that line and the conversation changes. Eli nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. He'd understood things like that since he was 10 years old, which was one of the facts about his oldest son that Silas carried with a particular complicated weight. The conversation changed sooner than either of them expected. It happened on a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks after the Bennett's arrival, during the midday break when most of the hands gathered near the main barn for water and whatever food they'd brought. Silas was at the far end of the yard talking with one of the older hands about a drainage issue when he heard the specific quality of silence that meant something was wrong. He turned. Cora was standing near the water barrel with a bucket, and around her were 4 of the younger hands. Not the worst ones, not Harlan's closest allies, but followers, the kind who take their cues from whoever seems most confident in the moment. They weren't touching her. They weren't close enough for that. But they were positioned in a way that created a kind of enclosure, and 2 of them were talking at her in overlapping voices that Silas couldn't hear from his distance. He was moving before he'd finished processing what he was seeing. As he crossed the yard, he heard one of them say something about her boots. Her patched, carefully maintained boots, that Cora had restitched herself with a needle and whatever thread she'd been able to find, and heard the others laugh. He stopped 6 feet away, not close enough to touch anyone, close enough to make the geometry of the situation very clear. "Cora," he said, "take the water up to the house." She looked at him. Her face was doing something that he recognized, the particular expression of a child fighting very hard not to show that they are hurt, because showing it would mean giving the people who hurt them something they wanted. She had learned that from him. He wasn't sure if he was proud of that or not. She took her bucket and walked away without looking at any of the 4 hands. Silas looked at each of the 4 men in turn, not with anger. Anger would have required more than this moment deserved, with something quieter and more deliberate. "My daughter," he said, "is 10 years old, and whatever you just said to her, I don't want to hear that it happened again." One of the 4, the youngest, a boy barely 20, had the decency to look at the ground. The other 3 held his gaze with varying degrees of defensiveness. "Wasn't anything," one of them said. "Just having a conversation." "With a 10-year-old girl you don't know," Silas said. "This is a working ranch," another one said, "not a daycare." "That's right," Silas said. "It's a working ranch, and every one of my children earns their place here same as I do, more than same as I do, some days." He let that settle. "This is the only time I'm going to say this in daylight, because if I have to say it again, it won't be in daylight." He turned and walked away. None of them said anything. That evening he found Cora in the cedar room, sitting in the corner with the good morning light, which was wasted at that hour, the sun having long since moved on, working on her boot stitching with a focus that was clearly a substitute for something else she was working through. He sat down near her and watched her work without talking. After a while she said, "They said nobody's going to make proper boots for a girl who can't pay for them." "They were wrong," Silas said. "They said my whole family is a joke that Vivienne Blackstone is playing on herself." Silas was quiet. "Are we?" Cora asked. Not plaintively. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, looking for information she could use. "No," Silas said. "How do you know?" "Because Vivienne Blackstone doesn't strike me as a woman who plays jokes," he said. "On herself or anyone else." Cora considered this, pulling the thread taut. "She looked at my boots when she came to the room," she said. "I saw her notice them." "She notices everything," Silas said. "She didn't say anything bad about them." "No," Silas said. "She didn't." Cora tied off a knot with the particular concentration that meant she was coming to a conclusion about something. "I think," she said slowly, "that she is a person who sees things for what they actually are instead of what they look like." Silas looked at his daughter. "I think you might be right," he said. "The men don't like that," Cora said, "because what they actually are is less than what they want people to think." It was, Silas reflected, not the first time his 10-year-old daughter had diagnosed a social situation more accurately and more quickly than most adults he'd known. "Probably so," he said. Cora snipped the thread, looked at her boot. The stitching was even and tight and would hold. "I'm going to need new thread before the end of the month," she said. "The brown I have won't last." "I'll get it," he said. "I can do it myself," she said. "I know you can," he said, "but I'll get it." She looked at him for a moment, and in that look was everything they didn't say to each other about the last 2 years, about her mother, about the moving and the starting over, about the cost of being 10 years old and already knowing how to hold yourself together in front of people who want to watch you crack. "Okay," she said. "Thank you, Papa." It was Vivienne who changed the next stage of things, though not in the way anyone expected. She had a habit, Silas had noticed, of appearing in places on the ranch at hours when most owners would be inside or managing correspondence, and asking questions of her workers that demonstrated she knew more about the specific details of the operation than most of them assumed. She knew which horse had been treated for a leg issue 3 months ago. She knew which section of fence had been repaired with the wrong gauge wire and was going to be a problem again by summer. She knew the names of every hand on the property, including the temporary ones, and she used them without ceremony. She appeared in the eastern sector on a Thursday morning when Silas was working alone, Eli having been kept back to help Thomas with a project near the main barn. "Walk with me," she said, which wasn't quite a question. They walked the fence line together for several minutes without speaking. It was a particular kind of silence, not uncomfortable, not weighted with unasked questions, just two people sharing space while they thought their own thoughts. Silas had met perhaps 3 people in his life he could share that kind of silence with. He was surprised, and careful not to show it, to find Vivienne Blackstone was apparently one of them. "My father built this ranch," she said finally. "Started it with 200 head and a boundary that was about a quarter what it is now. He was working it until the year he died, which was 4 years ago." "I'm sorry," Silas said. "He was ready," she said, in a tone that closed that topic without harshness. "He taught me everything he knew, and then some things he didn't know he knew, which are usually the most important things." She paused. "He also ran this operation with about as much warmth as a ledger book. He was fair, which matters a great deal. But fair isn't the same as—" She stopped, started differently. "The hands who've been here longest are efficient, and they're loyal, and they're good at their work. They're also running on a model that's 20 years old." Silas said nothing. He wasn't sure yet what she was telling him. "Harlan Briggs has been here 7 years," she said. "He's a skilled hand. He's also the reason I've lost 4 good workers in the last 2 years who didn't want to deal with the atmosphere he creates." Silas looked at her. "I'm aware of what he's been doing," she said simply. "I'm aware of the water bucket. I'm aware of what happened with Cora. I'm aware of most of the rest of it." "You didn't step in," Silas said. He kept his voice neutral, but it was a real statement. "No," she said. "I didn't." She stopped walking and faced him. "I needed to see how you handled it. A man who needs the owner to fight his battles isn't a man I can rely on for what this ranch needs." "And what does this ranch need?" Silas asked. She looked at him steadily. "Someone who doesn't back down," she said. "Someone who's been knocked flat and still gets up with his children and does the work and doesn't ask for sympathy and doesn't perform toughness for an audience." She paused. "Someone who isn't running this place like it's a machine that processes cattle." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're describing something bigger than a ranch hand," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." She started walking again. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you that the job I had in mind when I agreed to hire you is larger than what Caldwell told you. And I wanted you to know that before you hear it from Harlan in a distorted form, which you will." "What form will Harlan put it in?" Silas asked. "He'll tell people I'm planning to give you his position," she said. "He'll be mostly wrong. What I'm planning is different, but he won't want to hear the distinction." Silas stopped. "Vivienne," he said, using her name for the first time. She didn't react to it. "I need you to be straight with me. I've got 4 children in that house. If you're about to reshape something in a way that makes their situation here more precarious, I need to know now." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not going to make their situation more precarious," she said. "What I'm planning makes it more permanent." "How?" "Because I'm going to bring you into the management of this ranch," she said. "And when that happens, Harlan is going to have 2 choices: adjust to the new structure or leave. And whatever he does, your children's place here won't be up for debate anymore." Silas was very still. "You've known us 5 weeks," he said. "I've been watching this ranch for 6 years," she said. "I know what I'm looking at." He didn't say anything for a while. They stood there in the eastern sector with the early summer wind moving through the grass and the cattle drifting slowly in the distance. "I'll need time to think about it," he said. "That's reasonable," she said. "And I'll need to talk to my children." She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Something brief and quickly controlled, but real. "You talk to your children about decisions like that," she said. It wasn't a question, but it had the quality of one. "They're the ones who live with the consequences," he said. She looked at the cattle in the middle distance for a moment. "My father never talked to me about decisions," she said. "He made them, and I lived with them." She said it without bitterness, as a straight fact. "I always thought when I had my own ranch, I'd run it differently." She paused. I haven't particularly, up until now. Silas looked at her. Give me 3 days, he said. You have them, she said, and turned and walked back toward the ranch house. He stood in the field for another 10 minutes after she left, trying to figure out if he was reading the situation correctly and finding that he couldn't tell, which was itself information of a kind. That night he told the children, with all 4 of them at the table. He laid it out plainly. The offer, what it would mean, the risk it created with Harlan, the change in their position on the ranch if he accepted. He told it without slanting it toward yes or no, because he genuinely wasn't sure which direction he was leaning, and because his children deserved an honest account, not a performance of decision-making. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Thomas spoke first. She's been planning this since before we came, he said. What makes you say that? Silas said. Because she gave us the room in the house, Thomas said. She wasn't doing that out of kindness. She was doing it because she needed to see how we operated from closer range. She's been watching us the whole time. Silas looked at his 12-year-old son. That's a sharp read, he said. Thomas shrugged. It's what I do. If she's been watching, Eli said slowly, then she's already made up her mind. She's not asking. She's telling you in the form of asking. Possibly, Silas said. So the question isn't whether to accept, Eli said. The question is what we do about Harlan. That's one of the questions, Silas said. What are the others? Cora said. Silas looked around the table. Whether this is a place we're willing to stake ourselves to, he said. Really stake ourselves. Not arrive at and endure. Actually commit to. I want to stay, Owen said, with the uncomplicated directness of 6 years old. I like red, and I like Randall's biscuits, and I like my corner by the window. Owen, Eli said. I'm just saying what's true, Owen said. Cora was looking at her father. You like it here too, she said. I didn't say I didn't, Silas said. You don't have to say it, she said. You look different here than you did in Rollins, or before Rollins. You look like you're in the right place. Silas looked at his daughter and didn't know what to do with the accuracy of that. It's going to get harder before it gets easier, he said. If I accept this, Harlan isn't going to go quiet. He's going to get louder. So we deal with louder, Eli said flatly. We've dealt with worse. Silas looked around the table, at Eli with his crossed arms and his stubborn jaw, at Thomas with his careful eyes, at Cora with her direct, unsentimental gaze, at Owen, who was waiting with the patient expectation of someone who had already decided the answer and was just waiting for the adults to catch up. He thought about Clara, about what she would say. He thought she would say, "Stop talking about it and do the thing." "All right," he said. "We'll stay." He told Vivienne the next morning. She nodded once, with the expression of someone who had expected this answer, and said, "Good. We'll start with the eastern and northern sectors under your management. I'll talk to Holt." "You should talk to Harlan first," Silas said. She looked at him. "He's been here 7 years," Silas said. "If he hears it from Holt or someone else first, it's worse. You give it to him straight and direct, from you. That's the only way he has a chance to handle it with any dignity." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "You're protecting a man who spent a month trying to drive you off my ranch," she said. "I'm giving him the chance to behave better than he has," Silas said. "If he doesn't take it, that's on him, but the offer should be made." She studied him for a moment in the way she had, not like she was evaluating exactly, but like she was confirming something. "I'll talk to him this afternoon," she said. The conversation between Vivienne and Harlan happened in her office with the door closed, and Silas was not present and did not ask about it afterward. What he could observe were the effects. Harlan came out of that office and crossed the yard without speaking to anyone, and spent the rest of the afternoon working alone on the far fence line, which was where he went when he was in a mood that he didn't want to give an audience. For 3 days, the ranch held its breath. Silas ran the eastern and northern sectors, brought Eli in to help with the cattle rotation, and said nothing to provoke any confrontation. He worked clean and thorough and kept his head and waited. On the 4th day, Harlan came up to him at the water barrel at the end of the working day. Silas turned and faced him and waited. Harlan was a long moment looking at him without speaking. His jaw was working on something. There were several versions of what could come out of his mouth, and Silas was prepared for the worst of them. What Harlan finally said was, "I've been here 7 years." "I know," Silas said. I built things on this ranch that wouldn't have happened without me. I believe that, Silas said, and he meant it. Harlan looked at him with something complicated moving behind his eyes. I don't like this, he said. I want you to know that. I don't like how this has gone. All right, Silas said. But I'm not leaving, Harlan said. I've got too much in this place to walk away. All right, Silas said again. That doesn't mean we're square, Harlan said, or friendly. I know, Silas said. I'm not asking for either. Harlan held his gaze for another moment, then gave a short nod that communicated about 6 different things simultaneously and walked away. It wasn't peace. It wasn't anywhere close to peace, but it was the first time in a month that Harlan Briggs had walked away from Silas Bennett without a particular destination in mind for the damage. That evening, Thomas fixed a broken gear mechanism in the main windmill that had been causing the water flow to drop intermittently for weeks. He'd been observing the problem for 10 days, quietly, without telling anyone, until he understood it well enough to fix it in one session. He came into supper with grease on his hands and the particular expression of deep, quiet satisfaction that was the closest Thomas ever got to celebrating. Windmill's fixed, he said, and sat down. Silas looked at him. The main one? The gear was worn through on one side. I replaced it with the spare from the equipment shed. It was the right size. You took parts from the equipment shed? Silas said carefully. They were spares, Thomas said. There were 3 of the same size. I used one. Silas thought about this. You should have cleared it with Holt first. I know, Thomas said. I'll tell him tomorrow. Tonight, Silas said. You'll tell him tonight. Thomas looked at his plate. It'll probably cause a whole thing. It might, Silas said. That's part of it. Thomas pushed back from the table and went and found Holt and told him, and Holt came back with Thomas and looked at the windmill in the early dark and looked at the gear and said to Thomas, without expression, How'd you know what size to look for? I measured the broken one before I removed it, Thomas said. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Next time you ask first. After that you ask if you need to. Thomas nodded. Holt walked away. Thomas came back into the house with the expression of someone who'd been expecting worse and wasn't entirely sure what to do with better. He's basically the same as approving, Owen said from his corner by the window. That's not what he said, Thomas said. It's what he meant, Owen said, and went back to his drawing. Silas sat at the table that night after the children had gone to sleep, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling, the distant movement of cattle, the wind, the occasional voice of a hand doing late rounds, and thought about what Vivienne had said about this place running like a machine. He understood what she meant. He'd felt it from the first week. The efficiency was real, the competence was real, but there was something absent underneath all of it, some quality of life that had been optimized out of the operation somewhere along the way. He wasn't sure yet what he could do about that. He wasn't sure it was his place to try, but he was beginning to think, for the first time in 2 years, that he was in a place long enough to find out. The morning it really began to change was a Thursday in the 4th week when Owen was helping Randall in the kitchen, a privilege Owen had leveraged from biscuit diplomacy into a standing arrangement and managed to accidentally knock a full pot of something off the stove, and instead of hiding or lying about it, walked directly to the foreman's office and told Holt what had happened and offered to pay for it from his allowance, which was 5 cents a week. Holt stared at the 6-year-old standing in his doorway with his hat in his hands and his face covered in whatever had been in the pot. 5 cents, Holt said. Yes, sir, Owen said. It might take a few weeks. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Get yourself cleaned up, he said, and help Randall mop the floor. Yes, sir, Owen said. Should I bring the 5 cents? No, Holt said. Owen stood there a moment. But I should still come back and offer it. No, Holt said. I said no. Okay, Owen said. Thank you, sir. He started to leave. Owen, Holt said. The boy turned. Next time you're in that kitchen, Holt said, move slower near the stove. Yes, sir, Owen said with great seriousness, and left. Holt sat at his desk for a moment after the boy was gone. Then he picked up his pen and went back to his ledger. But something had shifted in his face, barely perceptibly, in a direction that nobody who saw it would have been able to describe precisely, except that it was different from what had been there before. Outside, the ranch kept running. The The cattle moved through the eastern sector. The windmill turned. The sun moved west. But in the space between what the ranch had been and what it was becoming, something was quietly taking root. The summer settled into the ranch like something that intended to stay. The work expanded, not because anything dramatic changed overnight, but because that's how real things grow, through accumulation, through one day's effort laid on top of the previous days, until you look back and can't identify the exact moment the ground shifted beneath you. Silas took over the eastern and northern sectors with the same quiet thoroughness he applied to everything. He didn't announce himself. He didn't restructure anything that didn't need restructuring. He learned what was already working and left it alone, and he addressed what wasn't working with the minimum of noise and the maximum of effectiveness. By the end of the 6th week, Holt had stopped checking his work. Not because Holt was careless, but because a man who checks work that's always sound eventually finds better uses for his time. Harlan watched all of this from a middle distance that he'd established and maintained like a property line. He did his work. He kept to his sector. He said less than he used to, which was a change that most of the ranch hands noticed without commenting on. A few of the men who'd been most vocal in his orbit, the ones who'd surrounded Cora at the water barrel, the ones who'd laughed at the wagon that first day, had grown quieter too, the way people grow quiet when the person whose lead they've been following changes direction without explanation. It wasn't peace, as Silas had told himself after that conversation at the water barrel, but it was a kind of cold stability, and he had enough experience with its opposite to know that cold stability was worth maintaining. What changed the temperature of everything was the weather. It came without the usual warning. Wyoming could turn in an afternoon. Any man who'd worked the territory for more than a year knew that. But this storm built from the northwest with a speed and density that even the oldest hands hadn't seen in October. By the time the clouds were visible from the ranch yard, the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees. By the time Holt called everyone together, the first flakes were falling sideways. "Northern Valley," Holt said, his voice carrying over the rising wind. "We've got 300 head in the low pastures up there, estimated 6 hours before that pass closes." The men looked at each other. The Northern Valley was a good 8 miles out, and the trail up was exposed on 2 sides. In the kind of storm that was building behind those clouds, exposed meant dangerous. Not difficult, not challenging, dangerous. "The herd can winter there," one of the experienced hands said. His name was Greer, and he'd been at Blackstone for 4 years. "It's sheltered enough once the storm proper hits." "The eastern end of that valley floods in hard snow," Silas said. "If the melt backs up under a freeze, we lose the low pasture sections first. That's where the herd will bunch." Several faces turned toward him. "You been up there?" Holt said. 3 times in the past 6 weeks, Silas said, checking the water flow from the upper creek. "There's a channel that's been running narrow since August. First serious freeze, it backs up. The east end becomes a basin." Holt looked at him. Then he looked at the clouds. "If he's right," Greer said, "we lose maybe 60, 70 head in the low sections, trapped against the fence before they can move to higher ground." "If I'm right," Silas said. "If," Greer said, and his tone made clear what he thought the probability was. "We've got 4 hours before that window is seriously dangerous," Silas said. 2 hours of workable trail, then it gets hard. But it doesn't get impossible until the back end of the storm." Holt looked at him with the measuring look that had replaced his initial indifference weeks ago. "You want to take a crew up?" "I want to move the eastern pasture animals to the high ground before the flood-out risk becomes real," Silas said. "The rest of the herd can manage where they are if we get the eastern bunch moved." "I'll go," Eli said, from behind Silas. Silas turned. He hadn't heard his son come out of the barn. Eli was standing there in his coat with his jaw set in the particular way it set when he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the discussion around it to catch up. "No," Silas said. "Yes," Eli said, with a calm that was more convincing than argument. They looked at each other for a moment, father and son, with the specific tension of 2 people who shared a stubbornness so deep it had become structural. "He knows those pastures," Holt said quietly, to no one in particular. Silas turned to Holt. "I've been taking him with me," he said. "He's been out there as much as I have." "I know," Holt said. Silas looked back at his son. Eli's face said everything. He was 14 years old and had been working cattle since he could sit a horse. And he was not going to stand in the yard while his father went into a blizzard alone. You stay on my left, Silas said. You do nothing I don't tell you to do. Understood, Eli said. I'm not negotiating. If conditions change, we turn back. Yes, sir, Eli said, which was how Silas knew his son was genuinely serious and not simply performing seriousness for an audience. They put together a crew of 6, Silas, Eli, Greer, who came around despite his doubt, 2 of the younger hands who'd been showing competence over the past weeks, and 1 older man named Purcell, who had worked the Northern Valley longer than anyone else on the property and knew the terrain the way he knew his own hands. They took the best horses and extra rope and the equipment they'd need to move animals in poor visibility. Thomas appeared at the barn door as they were saddling up. I checked the equipment shed, he said to Silas, without preamble. There are 2 of the heavy blankets in the back, the ones for the horses. You should take them. Silas looked at him. I already put them in Greer's pack, Thomas said. Silas mounted his horse. He looked down at his second son, 12 years old, with grease perpetually somewhere on his hands, and a mind that was always 3 steps ahead of the current problem. Keep Cora and Owen inside, he said. I know, Thomas said. Go. Silas went. The ride out was passable for the first 4 miles, hard wind, thickening snow, but workable. The trail was still visible, the horses managing without too much trouble. Silas rode at the front, Eli immediately behind him, and he could feel his son's presence the way you feel a fire behind you. Not by turning around, just by the warmth it throws forward. Greer came up alongside him around the 4th mile. You were right about the channel, he said, over the wind. He said it without any particular ceremony, which was how Silas preferred it. Let's see if I'm right about the rest, Silas said. If you are, 60 head is a conservative number, Greer said. That eastern section holds maybe 100 animals comfortable. Storm like this, they bunch. They don't move voluntarily to high ground because they don't know they need to. I know, Silas said. So we're moving cattle in a blizzard, Greer said. We're moving cattle in the early part of a blizzard, Silas said. There's a difference. Greer looked at the sky and apparently decided this distinction was too fine to be worth arguing, and dropped back. The northern valley revealed itself through the snow as they came through the pass, a wide white shape that had lost most of its definition to the storm, the tree lines blurred, the fence lines barely visible. But Silas could hear the cattle before he could see them clearly, the low, restless sound of a herd that had registered something wrong in the atmosphere and hadn't decided what to do about it yet. Eastern fence, he called back, and turned his horse southeast along the valley rim. They found them where he'd predicted. Roughly 90 animals in the eastern section, already beginning to bunch against the low fence that ran along the flood-prone ground, pressing together the way cattle press when the air is telling them something. The channel he'd been watching since August was already backing up. He could see the ice forming in the low curve of it, dark water spreading behind the freeze. We've got maybe 40 minutes before that's a problem, Purcell said, pulling up beside him. 30, Silas said. Let's work. What followed was 30 minutes of the hardest concentrated effort Silas could remember doing in recent years. Moving animals in deteriorating visibility with wind that was actively working against you required a particular combination of patience and urgency that most people couldn't sustain. Patience, because panicked cattle moved in the worst possible direction. Urgency, because the margin for error was shrinking by the minute. He worked the eastern edge while Greer took the western, and the 2 younger hands kept pressure on the rear of the group to prevent backsliding while Purcell moved ahead to open the gate to the high pasture. Eli worked the right flank. Silas had watched his son work cattle dozens of times over the years, in good conditions and poor ones, and had long since stopped being surprised by the quality of it. But in this, in the wind and the blinding snow and the noise of frightened animals and the clock running down, he saw something in Eli that he hadn't quite seen before. Not just competence, command. The particular quality of someone who understood the whole picture and was making decisions inside it, rather than just reacting to whatever was directly in front of them. He saw Eli notice 2 animals breaking from the group toward the flooding channel, turn his horse before Silas had spotted the problem, and cut the pair off cleanly, and redirect them without losing his position on the flank. The whole maneuver took maybe 30 seconds and required anticipating what would happen before it happened. Silas filed that away and went back to his own work. They got the animals through to the high pasture with roughly 10 minutes to spare before the channel flooded out the eastern section completely. Silas sat on his horse at the high gate and watched the dark water spread across the low ground where 90 cattle had been standing 20 minutes earlier, and felt the particular cold relief of something that had almost been a disaster settling into something that was merely a difficult afternoon. 93 head, Greer said, coming up beside him. I counted twice. Good, Silas said. Greer was quiet for a moment. I doubted you, he said. I know, Silas said. I was wrong, Greer said, and that was all he said about it. The ride back was significantly harder than the ride out. The storm had moved into its full expression by then, and the trail that had been workable on the way up was now a matter of judgment and horse sense, and the particular stubborn discipline of men who knew that panic was the most dangerous thing in bad weather and chose something different. Silas kept them close and kept them moving and didn't let himself think about what the ranch yard was going to look like when they arrived, because that was a future problem, and the only problem that mattered right now was the next 10 feet of trail. Eli rode behind him the whole way. Silas could feel him, that warmth, that presence. Steady. They came into the ranch yard well after dark, snow-covered and cold to the bone, and the light from the main house windows was the most straightforwardly welcome thing Silas had seen in longer than he could account for. Thomas was in the yard before they dismounted. 93? He said, looking at his father. Where did you get that number? Silas said. I counted the eastern section in the last tallies Holt kept, Thomas said, and I calculated the flood projection from the water measurements you'd been taking. I figured if you got all of them, you'd get 93. Silas looked at his 12-year-old son standing in the snow in the dark with a lantern. 93, he confirmed. Thomas gave a single decisive nod, as if a hypothesis had been confirmed, which it had. Cora appeared at the door of the main house. Get inside, she said, with the authority of someone who has been managing a waiting situation and is done with the waiting portion. I have coffee, and I have food, and I don't want to hear anything until you've had both. Greer looked at the 10-year-old in the doorway and then looked at Silas. Your daughter, Greer said. Yes, Silas said. She sounds like a ranch owner, Greer said. I'm aware, Silas said, and followed the others inside. Vivienne was in the main room when they came in. She'd been there, Silas gathered, for some time. There was a half-finished cup of something cold on the table near her chair, which suggested she hadn't been making herself comfortable but had been waiting. She looked at each of them as they came through the door with the focused attention of someone mentally accounting for what they'd sent out. She looked at Silas last. He met her eyes briefly. He was too cold and too tired for anything elaborate. 93, he said. Something moved across her face. Relief, first, then something more complex. The channel flooded out? The eastern section is 3 feet under by now, he said. We moved them with about 10 minutes to the good. She was quiet for a moment. Greer doubted you'd be right, she said. Greer came anyway, Silas said. That matters more. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then at Eli, who was standing near the fire with his coat still on, slowly returning to room temperature. How'd he do? She asked Silas, quietly enough that it was meant for him. Better than I did at his age, Silas said, which was the truest thing he'd said all week. Vivienne nodded once and went to refill her cup, and Silas sat down near the fire and started working his boots off, and tried not to think about how much everything ached. Owen appeared from somewhere and climbed onto the arm of the chair beside him, which was not a comfortable perch for either of them, but was apparently the only configuration Owen found acceptable. Thomas said you'd be fine, Owen said. Thomas was right, Silas said. I knew that, Owen said. I just wanted to hear it from you. Silas put one arm around his youngest son and didn't say anything, and they sat like that while the storm ran its course outside, and the fire threw heat into the room, and gradually the cold worked itself out of Silas's bones. The celebration of the herd was the town's idea, not the ranch's. Somebody, it was never entirely clear who had started it, had gotten word of the rescued cattle into Clearwater within 2 days, and within a week it had grown into the kind of story that territories love in winter, when there's little enough to talk about, and a story about courage in a blizzard fills the space that would otherwise be occupied by misery and cold. By the time the annual ranchers' gathering came around in late November, the story of the Blackstone herd was the kind of story that had already been told enough times that it had a shape, an arc, a set of fixed points around which the telling organized itself. What the story left out, in nearly every version Silas heard repeated, was the children. He noticed it the first time someone retold it at the hardware store in Clearwater, a rancher he'd met twice, talking to two others with the animated enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting to share a good story. The rancher mentioned Silas, mentioned Greer, mentioned the flood channel and the timing. Did not mention that a 14-year-old had worked the right flank in near blackout conditions and made decisions that saved a dozen animals. Did not mention that a 12-year-old had calculated the flood projection from water measurements before anyone else had thought to. Silas said nothing. He bought his supplies and left. The annual Ranchers' Gathering was held at the Clearwater Grain Hall, as it had been for 30 years, a large drafty building that held the combined weight of most of the valley's cattle operations. Their owners standing in their best coats with their best opinions, the specific social economy of rural wealth conducting itself through handshakes and bourbon, and the careful calibration of what you said to whom and in what order. Vivienne attended every year. It was, she'd told Silas when he asked, not something she particularly enjoyed and not something she considered optional. He went with her. She hadn't asked him to come in any formal sense. She'd said, in her characteristically direct way, "I'd like you there." And he'd taken that as what it was. The children he left at the ranch in Thomas's care, which Thomas accepted with the flat seriousness of someone being given a real responsibility, and Owen accepted with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been promised Randall would leave extra biscuits. The hall was loud with the particular noise of prosperous men in good moods. Silas moved through it at Vivienne's side and took the measure of the room the way he'd always taken the measure of a new place. Not looking for threat exactly, but cataloging. Learning who knew her, who deferred to her, who watched her from across the room, with the particular expression of people who were trying to calculate something about her and hadn't gotten there yet. He saw Harlan across the room in the first 10 minutes. Harlan was with a group of men from one of the neighboring operations, people he'd apparently cultivated connections with over the years, because they received him with the ease of familiarity. He caught Silas's eye once and looked away. The trouble started as trouble at these events usually does, with bourbon and an audience. A man named Aldous Reck, large-framed, red-faced, the kind of man whose confidence ran ahead of his intelligence by a reliable margin, had been working the room with the volume of someone who'd been at the bourbon since before he arrived. Reck ran a mid-sized operation to the south and had the territorial instincts of someone who'd built his position through the absence of real competition. He'd been looking at Silas since they'd walked in with the specific calculation of someone running numbers on a situation he didn't fully understand. It was the third hour of the gathering when Reck appeared at Silas's elbow. "Bennett," he said, with the familiarity of someone who hadn't earned it. "Hell of a thing, that business with the cattle." "Thank you," Silas said, keeping his voice neutral. "You and Greer and the others," Reck said. "Brave work." He paused, and the pause had a shape to it that Silas recognized. "Of course, I heard you brought your children along." "My oldest," Silas said. "Yes, into a blizzard," Reck said. He said it conversationally, but there were 3 men listening within range, and the audience was not accidental. "He's been working cattle for 10 years, Silas said. "He knows the territory." "He's a boy," Reck said. "He's 14, Silas said. "And he worked a flank in conditions that 3 of your experienced hands declined to ride out in." The air around that statement changed slightly. "Now see, that's the interesting thing," Reck said, leaning back on his heels. "What kind of man brings his children into that kind of weather? One might say that's judgment worth questioning." He glanced at the men nearby, gathering their attention. "Or one might say it's exactly what you'd expect from a man who showed up at a cattle ranch with 4 children and no resources. Using what you have, I suppose, even when what you have is, that's enough." The voice came from Vivienne's right side, and the quality of it, not loud, not heated, but carrying the specific density of a thing that will not be moved, silenced Reck more effectively than shouting would have. She had been standing 6 feet away, in conversation with 2 other ranchers, and had turned at some point that no one had clearly tracked. Reck looked at her. He had the sense to look slightly uncertain, which was probably the best anyone could have hoped for from him. "Vivienne," he said, "I know what you were doing," she said. She walked forward until she was part of the group, and the geometry of the conversation had changed. "You were making an argument about judgment and resources in front of an audience, and you were using a man's children as the instrument of it. She looked at him steadily. I've known you 11 years, Aldous. I know when you've had too much, and I know when you're being deliberately unpleasant, and right now you're managing to be both at once. Rex's face had gone a shade redder. I wasn't... Silas Bennett, Vivienne said, not looking away from Rex, but clearly speaking for the room. Rode into that storm because he knew something about the terrain that nobody else on the property had taken the time to learn. He brought his son because his son is one of the most capable young cattlemen I've seen in years. And because, and I want you to hear this part clearly, a Bennett on a bad day outworks most of what's in this room on a good one. The hall had gotten quieter, not silent. There was still the ambient noise of 100 people talking, but quieter in the immediate vicinity, the kind of quiet that spreads out from a specific point when something worth listening to is being said. 4 cattle operations in this valley have had herd losses this winter, Vivienne said. Blackstone Ranch has had none. I'd suggest that before anyone in this room starts questioning the judgment of the man responsible for that, they do some arithmetic. Rex opened his mouth, closed it. I'd also suggest, she said, that the next time you're inclined to call a 14-year-old boy's work into question, you consider what you were doing at 14. She turned back to her original conversation as if she'd merely stepped away briefly and picked it up where she'd left it with the composure of someone for whom that kind of intervention was a normal cost of doing business. The group around Rex dispersed with the particular quiet efficiency of people who don't want to be associated with a losing position. Silas stood where he was for a moment. Greer appeared at his elbow from somewhere. She does that, Greer said in an undertone. When she decides something is worth defending, she does it clean, and she does it once, and she doesn't look back. I've noticed, Silas said. First time I've seen her do it for a person, Greer said. Usually it's land disputes or water rights. Silas looked at him. I'm just saying, Greer said, and moved off. Silas found Vivienne an hour later near the far end of the hall, standing alone for a moment between conversations with a cup of something that had probably gone cold, looking at the wall with the expression of someone who has been managing a social environment for 3 hours and is giving herself 60 seconds of privacy. He came to stand beside her. Not close, just nearby. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. I could have handled Rex. I know that too, she said. She looked at the wall a moment longer. But I didn't do it because you couldn't handle him. I did it because what he was saying wasn't about you. She turned and looked at him directly. It was about your children, and I had something to say about that. Silas was quiet. Eli worked a flank in that storm, she said, that 3 of my adult hands refused to ride into. Cora has reorganized the kitchen operation such that Randall loses roughly 40 minutes less per day to logistics. Thomas identified a gear failure that would have taken out the main windmill in January. Owen... She paused, and something in her expression changed by a fraction that he'd learned to read. Owen talks to Red every morning, and she's the calmest she's been in 3 years. She said all of this without sentiment, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. Those children are not a charity arrangement, she said. They are assets to this ranch, and I will say so as many times as the situation requires. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. Not combatively. He genuinely wanted to know. She held his look. Because my father raised me on this land and never once told anyone I was worth something, she said. And I know what that costs. She said it without drama, with the flat honesty of someone who has done the work of understanding something painful and is no longer frightened of it. I won't do that to children who've earned more credit than half the men in this hall. Silas didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be proportionate to what she'd just offered him. After a moment, she said, We should go back. The McAllisters want to discuss grazing boundaries, and I've been avoiding that conversation for 40 minutes. Right, Silas said. They went back into the noise of the hall, back into the current of conversations and bourbon, and the accumulated weight of all these winter-hardened people managing their concerns. And Silas moved through it beside Vivienne Blackstone and found, for the first time in a long time, that he didn't feel like he was moving through hostile terrain. He felt like he was standing on ground he had some claim to, which was a new feeling, and not an unwelcome one. What he didn't know, coming home that night through the dark and the snow with the ranch lights coming up ahead of them in the distance, was that Harlan Briggs had also found something to say at that gathering, in a corner of the hall, to a group of men that included 2 property owners and a county official. What Harlan had said, carefully and without raising his voice, was that Vivienne Blackstone's judgment had been compromised, that she'd given authority to a drifter with 4 dependents over men who'd built their careers at Blackstone, and that the spring cattle drive, the largest and most financially critical operation of the year, was being planned by someone who'd been at the ranch less than 3 months. He planted it like a seed and walked away from it. Seeds don't announce themselves. They work in the dark, underground, in the particular quiet before the spring. But Silas had been a cattleman long enough to know that what grows in the dark eventually needs light to keep growing. And he'd learned, watching Harlan over these months, that a man who worked in darkness and planted seeds he couldn't claim publicly was a man who was out of legitimate options. That was something. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something. He turned his horse into the barn and unsaddled her in the quiet and methodical way he did everything. And by the time he walked into the main house, Thomas was asleep at the table over a book, and Cora had left a covered plate on the stove, and Owen had left a drawing on Silas's pillow that showed, in the angular, confident lines of a 6-year-old's hand, 5 figures of different sizes standing in front of a large house with a fence around it and the sun, oversized, as Owen drew all suns, coming up behind it. Silas sat on the edge of the bed and held the drawing in both hands for a moment. 5 figures, different sizes, 1 house, 1 fence, 1 sun. He set it carefully on the table beside the bed, lay down with his boots still on, and was asleep in less than 3 minutes, because that was what exhaustion and something quietly resembling hope could do to a man when they arrived at the same time. The seed Harlan had planted at the ranchers' gathering didn't sprout in a week. It took longer than that, which was the particular patience of a man who understood that certain kinds of damage needed time to work through a system before they became visible. January passed cold and uneventful. February brought 2 smaller storms and the particular cabin fever restlessness of a ranch in deep winter, when the work contracted and the walls felt closer, and people who'd been managing their grievances in the open air of an active operation suddenly had to manage them indoors. Silas felt the change in atmosphere before he could identify its source. It was the kind of thing you noticed the way you noticed a shift in wind direction, not through any single dramatic signal, but through the accumulation of small indicators. A conversation that stopped when he entered a room. An exchange between 2 of the hands that had the texture of something that had been going on for a while before he arrived. Holt being slightly more formal with him than usual, not hostile, but with a correctness that had an edge to it. On a Thursday in the 2nd week of February, Vivienne called him into her office. It was a room he'd been in perhaps a dozen times. Practical, organized, the desk covered in the working documents of a serious operation, maps on the wall, ledgers stacked in a way that suggested regular use rather than display. She was standing when he came in, which he registered. "Close the door," she said. He did. She turned to face him. "I had a visit from Porter Whitfield yesterday." Silas knew the name. County official. Land management. He'd been pointed out to Silas at the ranchers' gathering as someone who appeared wherever there was a conversation about property rights and grazing boundaries. He came to discuss concerns, Vivienne said. His word. Concerns about the management structure of the ranch and whether recent changes in authority represented sound judgment given the, and this is his phrase, inexperience and unclear background of newly installed personnel. She said it with her characteristic flatness, but underneath the flatness there was something tight. He was carrying something someone told him, Silas said. Yes, she said. He was careful not to name names. He was also careful to mention that 2 neighboring operations had expressed similar concerns, and that the spring grazing agreements, which are negotiated collectively and which Blackstone has participated in for 15 years, might need to be revisited if there were questions about the reliability of the ranch's management. Silas was still. He's threatening your grazing agreements, he said. He's delivering someone else's threat wrapped in official courtesy, she said, which is worse because it has institutional weight behind it. She turned and looked at the map on the wall, the territory, the boundaries, the shared grazing land that multiple operations depended on. If Blackstone loses its position in the collective agreement, we lose access to 12,000 acres of summer grazing. That's not survivable at our current herd size. The room was quiet for a moment. Harlan, Silas said. I don't know that, she said. I can't prove it. Do you believe it? She was quiet for a moment. I believe someone who knows this ranch well enough to know exactly which pressure point to push on made a decision to push on it, she said. And I believe they did it in a way that would be difficult to trace back. Silas looked at the map. The grazing boundaries were marked in different colors. Blackstone's allocation in red, the shared sections in black, the neighboring operations in blue and green. He'd spent enough time with those maps to understand the geometry of the valley's grazing economy and what it meant when any piece of it shifted. "What do you need from me?" he said. She looked at him. "I need you to understand that this situation has a specific origin and I am going to address it directly," she said. "And I need you to not do anything about Harlan before I do." He met her eyes. "I mean that," she said. "I heard you," he said. "Hearing and agreeing aren't the same thing," she said. "I won't do anything before you do," he said. "That's what I said." She studied him for a moment, then she nodded. "I'm going to talk to Whitfield again," she said. "And I'm going to talk to the ranchers he mentioned. And I'm going to do it in a way that makes the origin of this complaint visible without requiring me to make an accusation I can't substantiate." She paused. "That will take a week, maybe 2. During that time, I need the ranch operating without disruption." "It will," Silas said. He went back to work. The restraint required over the following 2 weeks was the hardest thing Silas had done since arriving at Blackstone Ranch, and that included the blizzard. The blizzard had been a problem he could ride into and solve with his body and his knowledge and his hands. This was a problem that required him to do nothing visible while someone else managed the solution, and the doing nothing was its own particular brand of exhausting. He saw Harlan every day, worked near him on 4 of those days, said nothing beyond what the work required. Harlan, for his part, maintained the same middle-distance equilibrium he'd established after his conversation with Vivienne, doing his work, keeping his sector, not provoking. But there was something in him that was slightly different now, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before, a man waiting to see the results of something he'd set in motion. Eli noticed. "He knows you know," Eli said one evening when they were checking the northern section after the workday. "Probably," Silas said, "and he knows you're not doing anything." "Also probably?" "Does that make it better or worse for him?" Eli said. He asked it as a genuine question, trying to understand the mechanics of it. "Depends on what kind of man he is underneath the rest of it," Silas said. "If there's any part of him that's capable of shame, then watching us do the work and not use what we know, that's harder than a direct fight. If there's not—" He paused. "Then it doesn't matter." Eli was quiet for a moment. "You think there is? Some part of that?" Silas considered it honestly. "I think he's been at this ranch for 7 years and he built real things here," he said. "And I think somewhere in there is a man who knows that what he did was beneath what he's built. Whether that matters to him or not, I don't know." Eli looked at the northern fence line and didn't say anything else. It was on the 12th day that Vivienne came back from Clearwater with her expression set in the particular way it set when she'd done something difficult and was satisfied with how it had gone. She didn't explain herself immediately. She went to her office and closed the door for an hour, and when she came out she was more relaxed in her shoulders than she'd been in 2 weeks. She found Silas in the barn in the early evening. "Whitfield is not going to pursue the grazing agreement question," she said. He looked up from the harness he'd been repairing. "How?" "I went to the 2 ranchers he mentioned and I sat down with them individually and I asked them directly whether they had specific operational concerns about Blackstone or whether they'd been told to have concerns." She paused. "One of them was honest with me. The other one wasn't, initially, but became more honest when I explained that I intended to make the source of these concerns known at the next collective meeting, and that anyone associated with it would need to explain their position publicly." "And?" Silas said. "And it turned out the specific concerns were considerably less detailed than Porter Whitfield had implied," she said. "And when they'd been aired and found to be mostly atmosphere and vague insinuation, Whitfield found that he had no particular basis for revisiting anything." "Harlan," Silas said. She looked at him. "One of the ranchers let slip a name," she said. "Not directly, but enough." "What are you going to do?" he said. "I've been thinking about that," she said. She sat down on a hay bale in the particular unself-conscious way she sat everywhere, without arranging herself or the surroundings to make anything more comfortable than it actually was. "I'm not going to do what he probably thinks I'm going to do," Which is? Fire him, she said, publicly. Make an example. She looked at the middle distance for a moment. He's been here 7 years. He built things on this ranch. I told you that before. She paused. But I can't keep someone who takes disputes outside instead of managing them inside. That's not about loyalty to you. That's about what kind of operation I'm running. So you're letting him go, Silas said. I'm giving him the chance to leave on his own terms before I make a decision for him, she said, which is more than he extended to you. She said it without venom, just as a fact. That's generous, Silas said. That's practical, she said. A man who leaves on his own terms doesn't have grounds to carry a grievance. A man who gets run off does. She looked at him. You taught me that, actually. Silas looked at her. When you told me to talk to him directly when you got the management position, she said. You were right then. I'm applying the same principle. He didn't say anything for a moment. How'd he take it? Silas said. When you talked to him? I haven't yet, she said. I wanted to tell you first. He nodded slowly. Whatever you decide, he said. I won't make it harder. She stood up from the hay bale and looked at him for a moment. I know that, she said. That's why I told you first. She talked to Harlan the following morning. Silas was in the eastern sector and not present, and did not ask about it later. He came back to the ranch yard at midday, and Harlan's horse was not in its usual spot at the hitching post. By evening, Harlan's gear was gone from the bunkhouse. By the next morning, there was no sign of him in the yard at all. He was simply no longer there, and the space he left was not as large as it might have been 6 months ago, because the man who'd left it wasn't quite the same man who'd been occupying it. 2 of the hands who'd been most in Harlan's orbit left within the week, voluntarily, having apparently decided that the operation's new direction wasn't to their preference. 3 others stayed. Silas made no particular effort with any of them in either direction. He just kept doing the work and waited for people to make their own calculations. Thomas made his calculation in early March. He came to Silas on a Sunday morning, a day they tried to keep lighter on all of them, though ranches rarely cooperated fully with that intention, and laid out on the kitchen table a hand-drawn diagram of the main water system's infrastructure with 3 areas marked in red. What is this? Silas said. The water system has 3 weak points, Thomas said. This one here, the main junction above the north pasture, is currently operating on a fitting that's the wrong size for the pipe diameter. It's been compensating through pressure adjustment, but the seal is going to fail before summer. This one, he pointed to the second mark, is a flow valve that's been partially closed for at least 2 years based on the mineral buildup on the housing. Opening it fully would increase water delivery to the south pasture by roughly 30%. And this one, the third mark, is a structural support on the main tank that's been repaired twice with materials that aren't rated for the weight. Silas looked at the diagram for a long moment. How long have you been working this out? He said. Since October, Thomas said. I wanted to make sure I had it right before I said anything. Silas looked up at his son. Show this to Holt, he said. I was going to show it to you first, Thomas said. You showed it to me first, Silas said. Good. Now show it to Holt. This is his infrastructure. He needs to see it from you. Thomas rolled the diagram up carefully and took it to Holt, and Silas stayed in the kitchen and heard, from a distance, the conversation that followed. Not the words, but the rhythms of it, the initial brevity, the lengthening exchange, and then a silence that meant Holt was looking at something with the attention it deserved. Later that afternoon, Holt came to find Silas in the tack room. Your boy, Holt said. Yes, Silas said. He's been observing the water system for 5 months. Apparently, Silas said. He's 12, Holt said. Yes, Silas said. Holt was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man adjusting a calculation that had been accurate for a long time and had just been shown to need revision. The main junction fitting, Holt said. I've had that on my list since last summer. I kept bumping it for other priorities. He flagged it as the most urgent, Silas said. He's right, Holt said. I'll order the part this week. He started to turn, then stopped. The flow valve. I didn't know about that one. Neither did I, Silas said. Holt nodded once, which for Holt communicated approximately what a standing ovation communicated for other people, and left. The spring arrived with the aggressive cheerfulness that Wyoming spring sometimes produced after a hard winter, as if the landscape itself was making a point. The grass came in heavy and green, and the cattle moved into the newly accessible pastures with the particular energy of animals who'd been managing winter on reduced grazing and were now making up for it. The spring cattle drive was Silas's first as the operational manager of the full ranch, and it was the thing, more than the blizzard, more than the water bucket incident, more than the ranchers' gathering, that the remaining hands would later identify as the point at which they stopped thinking of Silas Bennett as the woman's unconventional choice and started thinking of him as the man who ran Blackstone. He planned it over 3 weeks, working with Holt and Greer and the older hands who knew the drive routes and the timing and the particular complications that each section of the trail presented. He incorporated what they knew into a plan that was his own, and the plan was better for what he'd learned from them, which was the point of listening in the first place. He assigned positions based on demonstrated competence rather than seniority, which created some friction that he addressed directly and without apology, and the friction resolved. Eli rode point for the first time. It was not a decision Silas made easily or quickly. Point on a cattle drive was not a beginner's position. It required reading the herd's movement from the front, anticipating problems before they developed, and making decisions in real time that the entire drive's direction depended on. Eli was 14 3/4. He'd been doing it in pieces for 3 years, but doing it as the designated point rider, as the person responsible for that position, was different. Greer came to Silas the night before the drive started. "Eli for point," Greer said. It wasn't a question, but it had the weight of one. "Yes," Silas said. Greer looked at him for a moment. "I'll ride swing on his left," Greer said, which meant he was positioning himself to cover the gaps if something went wrong. He said it with no fanfare, just as an operational decision. "Thank you," Silas said. "It's not—" Greer started. "I know what it is," Silas said. "Thank you anyway." The drive took 11 days, which was on the faster end of the range. The herd moved well and the weather cooperated more than it usually did, and Eli held point for 9 of the 11 days, coming off it only when the conditions were bad enough that Silas pulled everyone into tighter positions. On the 3rd day, Eli made a decision at a river crossing that diverted the lead animals away from a section of undermined bank that 3 of the experienced hands hadn't caught. He'd seen the way the water moved at the edge and read it correctly, and the 300 animals behind the leaders followed without incident. Greer mentioned it to Silas that evening. "He saw it before I did," Greer said. "I know," Silas said. "I've been doing this 20 years," Greer said. "I know," Silas said. Greer was quiet for a moment. "He going to stay in cattle work?" "I don't know," Silas said honestly. "He's 14. I'm not making that decision for him." "Smart," Greer said. He paused. "Whatever he does, he's going to be good at it." Silas looked at the fire. "Yes," he said. "He is." They came back from the drive on a Friday, dust-covered and trail-worn, with the particular bone-tiredness of people who'd been moving with a purpose for 11 days and were now decelerating. The children who'd stayed at the ranch met them in the yard. Thomas and Cora and Owen and Vivienne standing a little apart with her arms crossed, watching them come in. Owen attached himself to Silas's leg before he dismounted and held on with the grip of someone making a point. 11 days, Owen said, against his father's boot. 11 days, Silas confirmed. Thomas said it would be 10. Thomas can ride point next time and we'll see how he does on the timeline, Silas said. Thomas, nearby, said nothing, but looked like he was filing this suggestion away for future consideration. Cora had made food, an actual meal, not just whatever was available, a proper dinner that filled the kitchen with a smell that made Greer stop in the doorway and take a long breath with his eyes closed. "Your daughter," Greer said to Silas. "Yes," Silas said. "She's going to be a formidable woman," Greer said. "She's already a formidable child," Silas said. "The formidable woman is going to be something else entirely." They ate together. The returning hands and the family and Vivienne, who sat at the long kitchen table without ceremony and ate what everyone else ate, and listened to the drive stories with the focused attention of someone who was always more interested in the details than the people telling them initially expected. She asked Greer twice about specific sections of the route, and she asked Eli directly and without the protective softening that adults sometimes applied to questions aimed at teenagers, what he'd seen at the river crossing. Eli told her. Precisely, without exaggerating and without undercutting it either. She asked 2 follow-up questions.
He answered both. She nodded and went back to her food.
And Eli, who was not a person easily impressed and did not wear his emotions where people could see them without his permission, had a look on his face for the rest of that meal that Silas couldn't entirely describe, except that it was the look of someone who had been spoken to seriously by a serious person and had found that they could hold their own in that conversation. It mattered. Silas knew it mattered. He let it be what it was. The second ranchers' gathering of the year was smaller than the winter one. A spring meeting focused on grazing agreements and water rights and the collective management of the valley's shared resources. It was the meeting at which the agreements that Whitfield had threatened to revisit were, in fact, revisited, routinely, as they were every year, with the adjustments and discussions that the annual cycle required. Silas attended this one too. The atmosphere was different from the winter gathering in the way that spring is different from winter. The cold was still there underneath, but the surface of things was warmer, less defended. People who'd looked at him in November with the measuring gaze of people cataloging an unknown quantity now knew something about him. The drive results were known. The blizzard recovery was still talked about. And Vivienne's defense of him at the winter gathering had been noted by every person in that room, because when Vivienne Blackstone spoke with that particular quality of conviction, people noted it. Aldous Reck was there. He nodded at Silas across the room with the careful neutrality of a man who has been humiliated in public and has decided that the best available option is to pretend it happened to someone else. Silas nodded back with equal neutrality, which was the end of that. The grazing agreement discussion went smoothly. Blackstone's position was confirmed without objection. The two ranchers who'd been cited by Whitfield in February were present and managed to be cordial in the way that people are cordial when they've been caught doing something they'd rather not own and have decided that behaving well going forward is the most efficient resolution. It was during the late portion of the meeting, when the formal agenda had been handled and the room had relaxed into the less structured exchange that always followed, that a rancher named Colum Abernethy approached Silas. Abernethy ran a medium operation to the east, had been at every meeting, and had never spoken to Silas before. "Bennett," he said. "Abernethy," Silas said. "My foreman's leaving end of summer," Abernethy said. "Bought land of his own. I'll need someone." He looked at Silas without any particular expression. "I'm not making you an offer. I'm telling you the situation, if you ever find yourself looking." "I'm not looking," Silas said. "I know," Abernethy said, "but situations change." He started to go, then turned back. "What you did with the herd in November, that was good work. My own operation had losses in the north section. I didn't have anyone who knew the terrain the way you knew it." "You will now," Silas said. "Whatever you lost last November, you know where the vulnerability is. You'll be ready for it next time." Abernethy looked at him for a moment. "That's an odd thing to say to a man who just offered you a job." "I'm not looking for a job," Silas said, "but I know what it costs when you lose animals you didn't have to lose. Figure you'd rather be ready." Abernethy studied him. "Vivienne's lucky," he said, which was as much of a compliment as Silas figured he gave anyone, and walked away. On the drive home, it was just the two of them. Vivienne and Silas, the horses moving at a comfortable pace through the spring evening, the light doing what spring light in Wyoming does, which is to make everything look slightly more valuable than it will appear in any other season. They rode without talking for a while. "Abernethy spoke to you," she said eventually. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "What did he want?" "To let me know his foreman position opens in the fall," he said. She was quiet. "I told him I wasn't looking," he said. Another silence. "Were you telling him the truth?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She nodded once and looked at the road ahead. "You've been at Blackstone 8 months," she said. "About that," he said. "The ranch runs better than it's run in 3 years," she said. "Holt told me that, and Holt doesn't say things like that easily." "Holt runs it well," Silas said. "I've just added some pieces." "Don't do that," she said without heat. "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller than you are," she said. "It's a habit. I've noticed it. You do it when someone says something true about your value, and you deflect it." She paused. "You don't accept deflection from your children when they do it. You shouldn't model it." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a fair point," he said. "I know it is," she said. They rode a little further. "The children," she said. "They're—" She stopped. started again. "I didn't anticipate this," she said. "When I agreed to take on a hand with 4 children, I was making a practical calculation about an asset. I wasn't anticipating—" She paused again, and the pausing was unusual enough for her that he paid close attention to it. "Owen told me last week that Red's stone bruise is fully healed and that he thinks she's ready for real work again, and he said it with this—" She stopped. He said it like it was the best news he'd heard all month. Silas didn't say anything. "I've been running this ranch for 6 years," she said, "after my father died, alone. And I built something good out of it. I'm proud of what I built." She looked at the road. "But there's a difference between something that functions and something that—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Lives," Silas said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Lives." The horses walked. The light continued to do what spring light does. "Vivienne," he said. "Don't," she said. Not tonight. I haven't decided what I think about any of this yet, and I won't say things I haven't decided." "I wasn't going to say anything in particular," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Yes, you were," she said. He thought about it. "Maybe," he said. She almost smiled. It was close enough to a smile that he counted it. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that had changed quality. Not uncomfortable, not weighted, but full of something that both of them understood and neither of them was ready to put words to yet, because some things needed to be carried a while before they could be set down and examined. The ranch came into view as they came over the rise, the lights in the windows, the shapes of the buildings against the last of the evening sky. And from the kitchen window, Silas could see the silhouette of someone moving, Cora, probably, doing the last of the evening tasks with the methodical competence she brought to everything. He looked at it, the lit windows, the solid buildings, his daughter's silhouette, and felt something in his chest that he'd been feeling more frequently over the past months and hadn't named yet because naming it felt like pressing on a bruise, testing whether what you thought was healing was actually solid or just surface. But tonight, riding in from the spring gathering with the valley spread out around them and the light going golden on everything, he pressed on it. It held. He wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. He wasn't sure it mattered. They rode into the yard and dismounted and went about the business of the evening, and the ranch received them the way it received everything now. Not like something unfamiliar arriving, but like something belonging returning to where it lived. The summer after the spring drive was the first season at Blackstone Ranch that felt, to Silas, like something other than a provisional arrangement. He couldn't have explained the difference precisely. The work was the same work. The days had the same structure they'd had since the first week. Early mornings, long hours, the particular rhythm of a working cattle operation that didn't vary much regardless of what else was happening around it. But something in the quality of it had changed. The way a man stands differently in a room he's decided to stay in versus a room he's just passing through. He hadn't made a formal decision. He hadn't sat down and announced anything to himself or anyone else. But somewhere between the spring gathering and the first week of June, the part of him that had been holding something in reserve, the part that kept one eye on the door, that didn't unpack certain things all the way, that noted distances and routes, the way a man notes them when he thinks he might need to know them in a hurry, that part had gone quiet. He noticed it first because of what it felt like when it stopped. A sound you've been hearing so long you've stopped registering it, and then one day it's gone, and the silence where it was sounds like something new. The children noticed the change before he did, or at least before he admitted it to himself. Cora had stopped keeping her good dress folded at the top of her bag where it could be grabbed quickly. Thomas had started a project, a careful documentation of the ranch's water system, its flows and pressures and seasonal variations, that would take years to complete and that could only have been started by someone who intended to be around for years. Owen had named 3 of the ranch cats, which he'd declined to do in the early months, explaining with the straightforward logic of a 6-year-old that you shouldn't name things you might have to leave behind. He named them in April: Biscuit, Trouble, and Sir. Nobody asked him why Sir. It seemed like the kind of question that would only produce an answer that raised more questions. Eli was the most complicated case, as Eli usually was. He'd been turning something over since the spring drive. Silas could see it in the way his oldest son moved through the days, doing his work with the same sharp competence he always brought to it, but with a quality of internal preoccupation that Silas recognized from looking in mirrors. It came to a head on a Tuesday evening in late June, when Eli came and found him at the fence he'd been repairing on the western boundary. He sat on the top rail and watched his father work for a while without saying anything, which was how Eli started conversations that mattered. Silas kept working and waited. "Greer said something to me today," Eli said finally. "What did he say?" "He said that the way I read the river crossing in May, the way I turned the leaders, he's never seen a point rider make that call that clean." Eli said it without pride, as information. "He said he's been doing this 22 years and he didn't see it." "Greer doesn't say things he doesn't mean," Silas said. "I know," Eli said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to do." Silas set down his tool and looked at his son. "With cattle work," Eli said. "With this. Whether this is what I'm doing with my life or whether it's just what I know how to do because it's what you do." Silas leaned against the fence post. "Those aren't the same question," he said. "I know that too," Eli said. He looked at the western pasture, the late light on the grass, the distant shapes of cattle moving. "I like this," he said. "I like it in the way that doesn't feel like liking something. It feels like it's just what makes sense. When I'm reading a herd or figuring a route or working a problem on a drive, it doesn't feel like work the way other things feel like work." "That's not nothing," Silas said. "No," Eli said. "But I don't want to do it just because I'm good at it, or because you do it." He paused. "Mama would have said something about figuring out what was really mine versus what I just inherited." The name landed between them the way it always did, quietly, with weight, the way stones land in deep water. "She would have," Silas said. "What do you think she'd say?" Eli said. Silas thought about it honestly. "I think she'd say that what you love and what you're built for are usually the same thing," he said, "and that the question isn't whether you inherited something from someone you love. It's whether it's true for you, whether it fits who you actually are." He paused. "You reading that river crossing, that wasn't something you learned from watching me. I would have caught it, but not as fast. That was something in you." Eli was quiet for a long time. "I want to stay," he said. "At Blackstone. I want to learn this operation and eventually run a piece of it, not because of you, because this place is right." Silas looked at his son, 14 years old, clear-eyed, asking for the real answer rather than the comfortable one. "Then stay," Silas said, "and do the work to earn it, not as my son, as yourself." Eli looked at him. "Have I been doing that?" he said. It was a genuine question. "Yes," Silas said. "Greer wasn't being kind when he said what he said to you. Greer isn't kind. He was being accurate." Eli sat with that for a moment. Then he climbed down from the fence rail and picked up the tool Silas had set down and handed it back to him. "I should let you finish," he said. "You should," Silas said. Eli started walking back toward the ranch buildings, and Silas watched him go. The particular walk of a person who has set something down and is walking away lighter, and went back to the fence. It was Vivienne who moved first in the end, which surprised him later when he thought about it. He would have predicted himself as the one to speak first, being the one who had more to lose and therefore more urgency about naming what needed naming. But Vivienne was not a person who allowed herself to be managed by urgency, and she was not a person who spoke before she was ready. And when she was ready, she moved with the same directness she brought to everything. It was a Saturday in early July. The work had been light that day, a rare thing, a day when everything that needed doing had been done and there was no immediate crisis demanding attention. The children had dispersed into their various occupations. Thomas at his water documentation, Cora helping Ada in the kitchen, Owen with the cats and the horses and the particular rotation he'd developed that seemed to satisfy everyone involved. Silas was on the porch of the main house in the early evening, which had become a habit without his entirely noticing, sitting with coffee and watching the ranch settle into the end of the day. Vivienne came and sat in the other chair. They sat for a while. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you say anything back." "All right," he said. She looked at the yard. "When my father died," she said, "I inherited this ranch, and I ran it the way he taught me, and I got good at it, and I told myself that was enough. That being competent and fair and building something solid was what a person could reasonably ask of their life." She paused. "And it was enough. It was genuinely enough for a long time." Another pause, longer. "You arrived with a broken wagon and 4 children and nothing else. And in 8 months, this ranch has more life in it than it had in the previous 6 years. And I am aware that that has nothing to do with your cattle management skills and everything to do with—" She stopped. "With what?" he said. "With the fact that you are a person who shows up entirely," she said. "You don't hold things back waiting to see if it's safe. You just arrive. All of you. And your children arrive, all of them too. And I have been watching that for 8 months, and I have been—" She stopped again, which was 2 stops in a row, which for Vivienne was roughly equivalent to another person's breakdown. "Vivienne," he said quietly. "I told you to let me finish," she said. "You did," he said. "Sorry." She took a breath. "I am not a person who was built for this," she said, "for saying this kind of thing. My father raised me to manage operations, not—" She made a small, frustrated gesture. "But I've been thinking for months about what I said to you on the ride back from the spring gathering, about the difference between something that functions and something that lives. And I know which one this has become, and I know what made the difference." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "I'm not presenting you with a condition or an ultimatum or a proposal. I'm telling you something true because I've decided it's more honest to say it than to keep carrying it around unsaid." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Can I talk now?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes." "Clara has been gone 2 years and 4 months, he said. "And for the first year I thought the part of me that could feel something like what I felt for her was gone with her. Because that's how it felt. Like a room that had been closed off, and the closing wasn't a decision, it just happened." He looked at his coffee cup. "And then we came here. And somewhere in the middle of everything, the blizzard, and Harlan and the grazing agreements, and Eli on point, and Owen naming the cats, that room opened again." He looked at her. Not the same room, different, but open. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for anything either," he said. "I'm not in a position to ask for things. I've got 4 children and a job at your ranch and no land of my own. The arithmetic isn't simple." "I run a cattle operation," she said. "I do arithmetic all day. The arithmetic isn't what concerns me." "What concerns you?" he said. She was quiet. "Getting it wrong," she said. "Moving too fast for the wrong reasons. Mistaking—" She paused. "Gratitude for something else. Or proximity. Or the fact that you are the first person in years who talks to me like I'm an ordinary person instead of Vivienne Blackstone of Blackstone Ranch." He looked at her. "You are both of those things at the same time," he said. "The ranch owner and the ordinary person. I've never had trouble seeing both." She looked away for a moment. When she looked back, something in her face was different. Not softened, exactly. More honest, maybe. As if she'd given herself permission to stop managing her own expression. "What do you want?" she said. Directly. Not what you're willing to accept or what you think is reasonable. What do you actually want? He sat with it for a moment. "I want to stay," he said. "Not as an employee. As something that doesn't have a clean name yet. I want my children to grow up here. I want to build something with you that outlasts the season." He paused. "And I want to be honest with you every day, which I think I have been. And I want you to be honest with me, which I think you have been. And I think that's more than most people manage." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's more than most people manage," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Yes," he said. Another silence. The ranch yard went about its business below them. The horses at the water trough, the distant sound of Cora's voice from the kitchen, the particular evening sounds of a place settling toward rest. "Let's not rush it," she said finally. "Whatever it is, let's let it be what it is and not force it into a shape before it's ready." "That's reasonable," he said. "I'm a reasonable person," she said. "You're a remarkable person," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "Don't say things like that," she said. "Why?" "Because I haven't decided what to do with them yet," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it and looked away, but the corner of her mouth did something that might have been a response to it. They sat on the porch while the evening came in over the valley, and it was the most honest and the most unresolved conversation Silas could remember having, and it was enough. Some things needed to be unresolved a while longer. That didn't mean they were in trouble. It meant they were real. The summer continued, the work continued, and the thing between them that didn't have a name yet existed in the daily fabric of the ranch. In the morning, conversations over the operational decisions. In the evenings, on the porch that became a habit for both of them. In the way the children related to Vivienne with an ease that had grown so gradually, it was hard to identify when the formality had stopped. Owen had no formality with anyone, which simplified his case. But Cora, who had been the most careful, who had watched Vivienne with the measuring gaze of someone who had lost one woman and was not ready to misplace her trust in another, had shifted by late summer into something that looked from a distance like genuine affection. It expressed itself practically, as everything with Cora expressed itself. She asked Vivienne questions about the ranch's history. She sought her opinion on the kitchen operations. She came to her one afternoon in August with the boots she'd been restitching for a year and laid them on the table and said, "I need new ones. I fixed these as far as they'll go." Vivienne had looked at the boots, the careful, determined stitching, the leather worn thin in 3 places, the soles replaced twice with material that didn't quite match, and looked at Cora with an expression that contained a great deal that she didn't put into words. "Let's go to Clearwater tomorrow," she said. "I can pay for some of it," Cora said. "You can pay for none of it," Vivienne said. "This is not a negotiation." Cora had considered this. "It's not charity," she said, using Silas's word with the precision of someone who had absorbed its meaning. "No," Vivienne said, "it's what you do for family." The word landed, and neither of them addressed it directly, which was probably right. Some things, said plainly in passing, carried more weight than the same things announced with ceremony. They came back from Clearwater with boots, and with 2 other things Vivienne had added without consultation: a proper winter coat for Owen, who had outgrown his, and a set of drafting tools for Thomas, who had been doing his water system documentation with whatever pencils and rulers he could find around the ranch. Thomas stood with the drafting tools in their wooden case and looked at them and then looked at Vivienne. "Thank you," he said. "You're documenting my water infrastructure," she said. "The least I can do is give you the right tools for it." "I would have done it anyway," Thomas said. "I know that," she said. "That's why." Thomas, who rarely showed his feelings in any direct way, closed the case with great care and took it to his corner by the window and didn't say anything else, which said everything. The fall came, and with it the second annual ranchers' gathering of Silas's time at Blackstone. It was a different event from the winter gathering. The November one had the weight of a season ending, of accounts being settled, of the valley's operations facing each other with the seriousness of people calculating whether they'd survive the winter ahead. The fall gathering was lighter, more social. The conversation still had substance, but the urgency was lower. Silas went with Vivienne again. I was known, this time. Not universally liked. A man who came from nothing and rose to managing one of the territory's strongest operations in under a year was not going to be universally liked, and he had made his peace with that. But known. Respected in the specific way that the Valley's ranching community expressed respect, which was through the willingness to talk to a man as an equal and ask him questions they expected real answers to. Abernethy came to find him in the first hour. "Foreman positions filled," Abernethy said by way of greeting. "Good," Silas said. "Man from Nebraska. Solid." Abernethy paused. "I want you to know I wasn't trying to poach you in the spring. I was just putting information in front of you." "I know that," Silas said. "You ever looking, you let me know," Abernethy said. "Professional courtesy." "I'm not looking," Silas said, "but I appreciate it." Abernethy nodded and moved on. It was the most straightforwardly friendly exchange Silas had had with a neighboring rancher since arriving in the valley, and it was 3 sentences long, which was probably about right. The moment at the gathering that he'd remember longest happened late in the evening, when the bourbon had been circulating for hours, and the room had reached the particular looseness that follows sustained socializing. A group of the older ranchers, men who'd been in the valley 20 or 30 years, who'd seen operations rise and fail, and who carried the institutional memory of the territory in their combined experience, had gathered in one corner, and Silas had been drawn into the edge of their conversation by Greer, who was part of the group, and who had apparently decided that Silas belonged there. The conversation was about legacy, about what the valley would look like in 20 years, about which operations were built on solid foundations and which were built on conditions that wouldn't survive a real test. One of the oldest men, a rancher named Aldrich, who'd been running cattle in the territory since before Silas was born, had looked at Silas and said, without particular ceremony, Blackstone's going to outlast all of us. You know that. I hope so, Silas said. Not hope, Aldrich said. Fact. I've watched that ranch for 30 years. Vivienne's father built something real. She built it stronger, and now he made a gesture that encompassed Silas and, by implication, everything Silas represented. Now it's got something it was missing. What's that? Silas said. Aldrich looked at him with the directness of a man too old to bother with indirection. People in it who intend to stay, he said. Not employees, not hired hands. People whose life is in it. He paused. That's what makes a ranch last. Not the land or the cattle or the water rights. The people who decide it's theirs. Silas held the old man's gaze. Thank you, he said. Aldrich shrugged with the elaborate indifference of someone who has just said something true and doesn't need it to be made into more than it is. Just observation, he said. 30 years of it. On the ride home, Silas told Vivienne what Aldrich had said. She listened with the focused attention she gave to things worth remembering. He's right, she said. I know, Silas said. When did you decide, she said, that it was yours? He thought about it. When Owen named the cats, he said. She looked at him. He wouldn't name things he thought he was going to leave behind, Silas said. When he named them, I knew he'd decided we were staying, and I figured if a 7-year-old could see it clearly enough to name the cats, I should probably trust the same instinct. She was quiet for a moment. 7-year-old has better judgment than most adults I know, she said. He'd agree with you, Silas said, enthusiastically. She almost smiled. The almost smile had been getting closer to an actual smile over the past months. He'd been tracking its progress with the patience of someone who understands that some things improve gradually and you don't rush them. What happened in November was not dramatic and not sudden, and had no single moment you could point to as the turn. It was more like what happens when a river changes course. Not an explosion, not a collapse, but the accumulation of water finding the lowest path until suddenly the water is somewhere it wasn't before, and you look at it and think, of course that's where it went. Vivienne told him on a Tuesday evening on the porch that she'd been in contact with her father's lawyer about the ranch's ownership structure, that she'd begun the process of establishing a formal partnership arrangement in which Silas would hold a documented share of the operation, not a gift, an acknowledgement of what was already functionally true. He started to say something about not needing it formalized. I know you don't need it, she said. I need it, because I want what's true to be written down somewhere. I want there to be a record that says this ranch belongs to more than one person, that it has people who intend to stay. He looked at her. There's another part, she said. Tell me, he said. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was deciding on the exact right words, not avoiding the subject. I want to ask the children, she said, if they'd be willing to have their names on the ranch documents too, not as heirs or anything formal right now, just as... She paused. I want there to be a paper somewhere that has all their names on it next to Blackstone Ranch, because they've earned that, and because I want them to know it, and because... She stopped. Owen told me last week that this was his home. He said it like it was the most obvious thing he'd ever said. And I thought, if he already knows it, then I should make sure the paperwork agrees. Silas sat with that for a long moment. There was a version of him. The version that had driven a breaking wagon into this ranch 8 months ago with 4 hungry children and nothing else, who would have been overwhelmed by this, who would have needed to manage the emotion of it very carefully to avoid showing what it cost to be offered something this large. That version of him was still present, somewhere underneath. But sitting on this porch, in this evening, he was able to receive what she was offering without flinching away from the size of it. Yes, he said. They'll say yes. You're sure? She said. Owen will probably ask if the cats can be on it too, he said. She looked at him. I'll see what the lawyer says, she said. And then she was smiling, actually smiling, not the almost version, the real one. And it was the most complete expression he'd seen on her face in 8 months of watching her face, and he thought, there it is. That's who she is under all the rest of it. He didn't say it out loud. Some things you hold privately because they're more true that way. They told the children together the following evening at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, with the remains of supper still around them, and the kitchen warm from the stove and the cats, Biscuit, Trouble, and Sir, occupying their usual positions along the window ledge. Vivienne explained it plainly, in the direct way she explained everything. What the document would say, what it meant practically, what it meant in terms they didn't have a clean legal word for, but that everyone at the table understood. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Owen said, "Does that mean this is really our house?" "Yes," Vivienne said. "Like we can't get told to leave?" "Not without a fight," Vivienne said, "and I don't lose fights." Owen appeared to find this completely satisfying. He turned back to his plate. Cora was looking at Vivienne with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. "You don't have to do this," Cora said. "We're not—" She stopped, started again. "Papa has already made it so we belong here. You don't have to make it official." "I know I don't have to," Vivienne said. "That's why I want to." Cora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you." Thomas said, "I'd like to see the documents before they're filed, to make sure the water system infrastructure is listed as a ranch asset rather than a maintenance cost, because I've been documenting it as an asset for 6 months, and I'd like the paperwork to be consistent." Everyone looked at him. "What?" he said. "That's your response?" Eli said. "It's a practical concern," Thomas said. "It's the most Thomas thing anyone has ever said," Cora said. Thomas looked unruffled. "Someone has to think about these things," he said. Eli had been quiet through all of it, watching with the careful attention he brought to situations that mattered. When the table had settled, he looked at Vivienne. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer me the same way you'd answer an adult, not the version of it you'd tell a kid." Vivienne met his eyes. "All right," she said. "Do you love him?" Eli said. "My father." The kitchen went very quiet. Vivienne looked at Eli for a long moment. Then she looked at Silas, and the look was the full version of something she'd been parceling out in pieces for months, and Silas held it without looking away. She turned back to Eli. "Yes," she said. "I do." Eli nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "That's all?" Cora said. "That's what I needed to know," Eli said. He went back to his food. The marriage happened in the spring of the following year. Not a large ceremony, because neither Silas nor Vivienne were people who required audiences for the things that mattered. A judge from Clearwater, a handful of people from the valley who'd become something like genuine friends, the 4 children standing in their best clothes with the particular dignity of people who understood what they were witnessing. Owen cried. Not unhappily. Owen cried easily and without embarrassment at things that moved him, which was a quality Silas had privately decided was one of his youngest son's finest. He stood next to Cora and cried with his chin up, which Cora observed with the expression of someone who both found this exasperating and loved him without reservation for it. Silas had not planned what to say when the moment came. He'd thought about it and rejected every version he'd mentally drafted because they all sounded like someone trying to say the right thing rather than the true thing. So when the judge looked at him, he said what was actually in his mind at that moment. "I came here with nothing," he said to Vivienne, "and this woman, this place, gave my children ground to stand on when the world was doing its best to take it away. I don't have the words for what that cost someone, but I intend to spend however long I've got trying to be worth it." Vivienne looked at him. "You already are," she said, and that was all she said, and it was enough. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. Ranching is not a life that promises ease, and Wyoming in particular seemed to reserve the right to test the people who decided to stay in it. There were hard winters and dry summers, and a cattle fever outbreak in Silas's 3rd year that cost them 30 animals and 3 months of brutal containment work. There were disagreements, real ones, the kind that come from 2 people who are both strong-headed and certain of their own judgment navigating the same operation. There was a year when the water table dropped so severely that Thomas's documentation of the water system, completed by then in 4 careful volumes, became the most valuable document on the property and possibly in the county. But there was also this. Eli became one of the strongest trail bosses in the territory by the time he was 22. Not because he'd inherited his father's skills, he had those, but because he had something his father had never fully had at that age, which was the confidence of someone who had grown up knowing exactly where he belonged. He rode with a certainty that other men recognized and followed, and the drives he ran out of Blackstone Ranch in those years were talked about in the valley for years after. Thomas, at 19, was asked by 3 neighboring operations to consult on their water infrastructure. He said yes to 2 of them and no to one on the grounds that that operation's approach to resource management was short-sighted, and he didn't want his name associated with work he couldn't stand behind. He said this to the rancher directly, which caused some offense, but the rancher later came back and asked him to explain what he meant, and the conversation that followed changed how that operation managed its water for the next decade. Cora, who had restitched her boots at 10 with whatever thread she could find, had by 17 turned the ranch's supply and logistics operation into something so efficient that Holt admitted openly she'd improved on a system he'd built over 15 years, and he said it without resentment, because by then Holt had arrived at the understanding that some people made the things around them better, and the correct response to that was to recognize it, not protect against it. Owen grew up on Blackstone Ranch the way some people grow up in places that fit them exactly, not without struggle, not without the ordinary difficulties of growing and learning and getting things wrong, but with the deep-rooted ease of someone who never had to question whether they were where they were supposed to be. He had a gift with animals that none of the others had, a quality of attention that wasn't trainable, that was simply in him, and the horse program he eventually developed at Blackstone became something that people came from other territories to see. Red lived to be 27 years old. Owen was with her at the end, which was right. And Silas Bennett, who had arrived at Blackstone Ranch with a broken wagon and 4 hungry children and the particular hollowness of a man who has been keeping himself together by willpower alone for too long, who had stood in a dusty yard while men laughed at him and had not looked away, who had fought for his children's dignity in the only way he knew how, by showing up every morning and doing the work with everything he had. Silas built a life that fit the shape of what he actually was. Not a perfect life, not a story without grief or loss or the accumulation of small failures that any honest life contains, but a true one, a life in which the people who mattered most to him had ground under their feet and a place that would not ask them to leave, and in which the woman he'd come to love was also the person he most respected, which he had learned by then was the more durable combination. There is something worth saying about the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside, the kind that isn't about riding into storms, though Silas had done that too, but about continuing to show up in the places that have rejected you, continuing to do good work when no one is watching and when the people who are watching to see you fail. The kind of courage that says, I will not become smaller to make other people more comfortable. I will not stop arriving fully because the welcome has been limited. Most people who knew the story of the Bennetts and Blackstone Ranch would tell it as a story about a woman who took a chance on an unconventional hire and was proven right. That version isn't wrong, but it leaves something out. What Silas Bennett and his 4 children did was not simply survive a hostile welcome. They did the harder thing, which is to refuse to let that hostility change who they were. Owen kept offering his hand to the difficult horse. Thomas kept documenting what he observed, even when no one had asked him to. Cora kept stitching her boots and holding her head up. Eli kept doing his work with full commitment in a place that hadn't yet decided whether to accept him. And Silas kept getting up every morning and doing what he was built to do, in a place that was slowly becoming what he needed, because the only way any place ever becomes home is through exactly that, showing up for it before it's earned and trusting that the showing up is itself the answer. The laughter in the yard that first day, the hands who'd made their bets about how long the broke cowboy with 4 mouths would last, faded into the ordinary noise of years. The men who'd made those bets were mostly gone within 3 years, replaced by people who came to Blackstone because it had a reputation for being a place that judged a person on their work and nothing else. And on a morning in Silas's 5th year, when Owen was 11 and standing in the yard with Red in the early light, talking to her in the low, continuous murmur that had always been their private language, Vivienne came to stand beside Silas on the porch with her coffee and looked at their youngest son and said quietly, "He's always known he was home." Silas looked at his son in the morning light. "Since the 2nd week," he said. "What about you?" she said. He thought about the drawing on the pillow. 5 figures of different sizes, 1 house, 1 oversized son coming up behind it. "Since about the same time," he said. "I just took longer to say it." She leaned against him. Not dramatically, just a shift of weight, the way you lean against something solid when you know it will hold. And they stood there while the morning came on, and the ranch woke around them, and their children moved through the day that was just beginning. It wasn't the life Silas had planned. It was considerably better than the life he dared to want. And it had cost exactly what the real things always cost: the willingness to keep standing in the place where you decided to plant yourself, through every season, until the roots went deep enough that nothing could move you. That was enough. That had always been